Hey there and welcome back. If you are settling in now, drawing the blankets close and letting the day begin to loosen its hold on you, then you have come to just the right place, and there is nothing more you need do tonight than lie still and let yourself be carried somewhere far away. For tonight we are going north, and we are going back, a long way back, near 400 years, to a winter's night in an old grey city built on rock above the cold sea firth, a city of tall stone houses crowded close along a single ridge of street that ran down from a castle on its crag to a palace in the hollow below. We are going to Edinburgh, in the deep of a Scottish winter, in the year 1644, and we are going to climb the dark turnpike stair of one tall house, in one narrow close off the high street, and let ourselves in, unseen, to share an ordinary evening with the merchant's family who live there, the fire lit, the supper cooking, the shutters barred against the cold. It is a snug house and a settled one, full of the small comforts of its age, and we will see the whole of it tonight, from the booth at the street where the day's trade is being shut up, to the high box bed under the rafters where the youngest child is already asleep. And yet there is, this winter, the faintest thread of something else in the air of the city, a word half heard in the close, a rumour carried up from the harbour at Leith, a ship turned away, a sickness spoken of in some far burgh, nothing certain, nothing near, only a small unease at the edge of things, the way a cold draught finds its way under a well-shut door. We will not dwell on it tonight. The evening is warm, and the family is safe, and the trouble, if trouble it is still far off. But it is there, faint, at the edge of the firelight, and it is part of the truth of this particular winter, and so I will not pretend it away. For now, though, there is only the climb up the dark stair, and the cosy room at the top, and the quiet Scottish night ahead. Let us take it slowly. Before we climb the stair, let me say a brief word about why I make these long evenings, and about the strange and lovely fact of your being here at all, wherever in the world you happen to be lying as you listen. These journeys into the past are put together slowly, read into with care, and made for one purpose only, which is to give you somewhere peaceful to rest your mind at the close of your own day, whatever sort of day it has been. If you find that they carry you off gently towards sleep, you would be most welcome to subscribe, so that the next of them finds its way to you of its own accord, the way a friend comes to the door without being sent for. And if you feel inclined, I would dearly love to know what part of the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, for I read everything that comes back to me, and there is a deep and settling pleasure in the thought of so many of us, scattered across so many countries and climates and times of night, all of us drawing in toward the same warm imagined fire, the same old stone house on the same dark Scottish street, all of us seeking the same quiet shelter at the end of the day. But none of that need trouble you now. It will keep until the morning, for now there is only the cold dark street, and the tall house above it, and the firelight waiting at the top of the stair. So picture this. It is a little after 5 o'clock on an afternoon in the deep of winter, in the year 1644, and the early dark of a northern winter has already come down over the city. For in these high latitudes the light fails early and lingers late, and by mid-afternoon the short day is spent. We are standing in the high street of Edinburgh, the central spine of the old town, a broad steep way of beaten earth and stone that runs down the back of the ridge from the castle above to the abbey and palace far below, and on either side of it rise the houses, and such houses as no other city in the land could show, for the old town of Edinburgh, hemmed in by its walls and its loch, and the lie of its narrow ridge, had nowhere to grow but upward, and so its houses had climbed, storey upon storey, 5 and 6 and 7 and more, tall gaunt stone tenements crowded shoulder to shoulder along the street, and down the steep dark closes that ran off it on either side like the bones from a spine. The houses are dark against the last grey of the sky, but here and there a shuttered window leaks a thread of yellow light, and the smell of 1,000 peat and coal fires hangs low and brown over the ridge, the breath of the city in the cold. Down the street a few late figures hurry homeward, muffled against the wind that comes raw off the firth, their feet slipping on the frozen filth of the causeway. A caddie passes with a lantern. From somewhere comes the cry of the town guard, and the slam of a shutter, and then the wind again. And there, on the north side of the street, where a narrow dark mouth opens between two tall lands, is the close we have come to, and up that close, at the top of a steep turnpike stair, is the house, with the firelight waiting behind its shutters. Come with me. The stair is dark and steep, and we must feel our way, but the door at the top is about to open, and no one within will ever know that we climbed up out of the cold behind them. Before we climb the stair, let me hold us a moment longer in the street, for the city itself is the beginning of the story, and there was no city in all the kingdom quite like Edinburgh in this age, and to understand the house and the family we are going to, you must first understand the strange, tall, crowded town they lived in. For Edinburgh was a city pressed into a space too small for it, and that pressing had made it like nowhere else. It stood, the old town, along a single narrow ridge of rock, a long spine sloping down from the castle on its sheer crag at the head to the Abbey of Holyrood in the hollow at the foot, and the life of the city was strung along that one ridge and the steep slopes that fell away on either side. To the north lay a loch, the Loch, a dark sheet of water filling the valley foul and stagnant that hemmed the city in on that side. To the south ran the town wall, throwing its girdle about the crowded houses. And between the loch and the wall there was only the ridge, and on the ridge there was only so much room, and into that room the city had to fit the merchants and the lawyers and the craftsmen and the labourers and the poor, the rich and the wretched, all crowded together onto the one long steep ridge of rock. And so the city had grown the only way it could, which was up, where the cities of the south spread out across their plains, building low and wide. Edinburgh, penned on its ridge, had built high and narrow, its houses climbing story upon story toward the sky, until they were the tallest dwellings in the land, gaunt stone towers of 5 and 6 and 7, and even more floors. The famous tall lands of the old town packed shoulder to shoulder along the high street, and crowding down the dark closes on either side. And in those tall houses lived a whole vertical world, for unlike the cities of the south, where the rich kept to their quarters and the poor to theirs, in the crowded tall lands of Edinburgh, all sorts lived stacked one above another in the single building, the poorest in the cellars and the cold garrets at the very top, the prosperous and the genteel in the good well-built middle floors, the whole of society piled vertically into the one tall house, the merchant and the caddie and the widow and the labourer climbing the same dark common stair to their different doors. It was a city of extraordinary closeness, of crowding, of all sorts pressed up against all sorts, the high and the low living within a few feet of one another, up and down the same stairs, along the same narrow closes, breathing the same brown smoky air of the crowded ridge. The closes themselves were the veins of this crowded body, the narrow steep passages, scarcely wider in places than a man's outstretched arms, that ran off the high street on either side and plunged down the steep flanks of the ridge between the towering lands, dark even at noon, the houses leaning close overhead so that little light reached the bottom, the way underfoot steep and slippery and foul, for the closes were where the refuse of the tall houses came down, flung from the windows above with the old cry of warning, the filth running down the steep gutters toward the loch below. They had their names, the closes, hundreds of them, named for a trade carried on there or a notable who had lived there or some half-forgotten thing, and each was its own small crowded world, its tall houses full of families stacked floor on floor, its dark stair climbed by all who lived above, its mouth opening onto the bright public life of the high street, and its foot descending into the dark and the steep and the poor. To live in Edinburgh was to live in a close, to climb its stair, to know its smells and its sounds and its neighbours above and below, the whole intimate, crowded, vertical life of the old town. And the high street itself, the spine to which all the closes ran, was the heart and the stage of the city, the broadest and grandest street in Scotland, where the life of the town came together. Down its long steep length stood the public buildings, the high kirk of St. Giles with its crowned tower, the toll booth that was prison and council house and heart of the burgh's government, the market crosses where proclamations were cried and justice was done, the lechan booths and the cramies, the little locked shops and stalls that crowded about the kirk and along the street where the trade of the city was carried on. Here the merchants had their booths, here the markets were held, here the people gathered, here the processions passed, and the public business of the burgh was done. The whole bright, crowded, commercial, civic life of the city played out along the one broad, steep street, while behind it, up the dark closes, the people lived their crowded private lives in the tall stone lands. It was a city like no other, tall and dark and crowded and intense, pressed onto its ridge between the loch and the wall, climbing toward the sky, and it is into one of its tall houses, up one of its dark closes, that we are going now to share an ordinary winter's evening with the family who lived there near 400 years ago. So let us turn in, now, from the high street into the dark mouth of the close, and climb to the house, for the way up to a home in the old town was itself a journey, and worth our taking slowly. We leave the broad street behind, with its last grey light and its hurrying figures, and step into the close, and at once the dark closes round us, for the close is narrow and deep, and the tall houses lean packed together overhead, and even by day little light comes down to the bottom of it, and now, in the winter dusk, it is near to black, lit only by the faint leak of light from a shuttered window high above, and the far glow of the street behind us. The way underfoot is steep, for the close drops away down the flank of the ridge, and it is paved with worn stone, slick now with the frost and the damp and the filth of the crowded houses above, so that we must go carefully, feeling our way, one hand to the cold wall. The air is close and brown with smoke and heavy with the smells of the crowded ridge, the peat and the coal, the cooking, the middens, the whole thick, intimate smell of a city pressed too close together. From the houses on either side come the sounds of the evening, a voice raised, a child crying, the clatter of a pot, a snatch of a psalm, the crowded life of the close going on behind its walls and shutters in the dark. And here, a little way down the close, is the entry to our house, a low arched doorway in the stone, and within it the foot of the turnpike stair, the spiral stone stair that climbed up through the heart of the tall land to the floors above. For these tall houses were climbed by such stairs, the turnpike, a spiral of stone steps winding up around a central newel within a round tower built against the back of the house, narrow and steep and dark, the common way up for all who lived in the land, the single stone thread that strung together the stacked floors and the stacked families of the tall house. We begin to climb, and the stair winds up before us, each step worn hollow in its centre by the feet of generations, the wall curving close on either hand, the dark near total, but for what little light we have brought with us in the mind's eye. It is a steep climb and a long one, for the house is tall, and our family lives well up it, on one of the good middle floors, above the damp and the dark of the lower stories and below the cold of the garrets at the top. And as we climb, we pass the doors of the other households of the land, for each floor has its door off the stair, and behind each lives another family, stacked one above another up the tall house, the vertical community of the land climbing this same dark stair to their different homes. We pass the doors then, climbing the door of the poor family on the lower floor, the door of the widow, the door of the craftsman, each shut against the stair, each with its own life behind it, until we come, well up the tall house, to the door of the family we have come to see, the merchant's door, on the best floor of the land, and behind it, leaking faintly round the edges of the door, the warm yellow light of the fire and the candles, and the muffled sounds of the household at its evening, and the smell drifting out onto the cold stair of the supper cooking within. We have arrived. The dark, cold clime is behind us, and beyond this door is warmth and light, and the family at home. And the door is opening, for someone within has business on the stair, and the warmth and the light spill out for a moment onto the dark landing, and we may slip in, unseen, out of the cold, into the home. Let us stand a moment just within the door, and let our eyes adjust to the light, and take in the home we have entered. For after the dark, cold clime, the warmth and the light of it come as a blessing. We are in the hall, the main room of the house, for in a dwelling such as this the principal room served many purposes at once, and it is here that the life of the family chiefly went on. It is a room of fair size, low-ceilinged, its walls of bare stone or panelled in dark wood or hung with a coarse painted cloth, its floor of worn boards strewn perhaps with a little dried herb or rush, its small deep windows set in the thick stone wall and now shuttered fast against the cold and the dark. And the room is warm, blessedly warm after the stair, warmed by the fire that burns in the wide stone fireplace, a fire of peat and coal that throws its red light and its good heat out across the room, the living heart of the house. By its light, and by the light of a candle or two, we can see the room and its comforts, the heavy dark furniture, the press and the kist and the board, the pewter gleaming dully on the shelf, the family gathered in the warmth, and we can smell the good smell of the supper cooking, and hear the small sounds of the household at its evening, and feel, settling over us, the deep comfort of a warm home on a cold winter's night 400 years ago, at the top of a dark stair, in a tall stone house, in the old grey city on its ridge above the sea. Let us look now at the family whose evening we have come to share, for they are worth our knowing, and they are a particular kind of family, of a particular standing in the life of the city. The master of the house is a merchant, a burgess of Edinburgh, which is to say a man who has the freedom of the burgh, the right to trade within it, and the standing of a full member of its community, and that was no small thing, for the merchants of Edinburgh were the chief men of the town, the rich and the powerful, those who ruled the burgh and carried on its great trade and stood at the head of its society. He is not among the very greatest of them, the few merchant princes whose wealth and power rivaled the nobility, but he is a man of substance and good standing, a prosperous trader with his booth on the high street and his goods coming and going through the port of Leith below, his name known and respected in the burgh, his place secure among the comfortable middling sort of the merchant class. He is a careful man and a godly one, as the men of his city and his time were bred to be, sober in his dress and his manner, diligent in his trade, grave in his bearing, a man who keeps his accounts and his conscience with equal care. His wife, the good wife of the house, is the mistress of all its domestic life, and a woman of weight and authority in her own sphere, for in a household such as this, the wife ran the home as the husband ran the trade, and her dominion over the kitchen and the servants and the children and the whole running of the house was real and respected. She keeps the house, orders the provisions, governs the maids, sees to the children, manages the stores and the linen and the 1,000 details of the household economy, and she does it with the brisk, capable authority of a woman bred to the task. For the running of a substantial household was a serious labour and a serious skill, and a good goodwife was the foundation of a prosperous home. She is, like her husband, godly and careful and grave, but there is warmth in her too, the warmth of a mother and a mistress who holds her household together, and the home owes its comfort and its order to her as much as to anything. And there are the children, several of them, for families ran large in this age, when children came often, and many did not live to grow, and the children of the house range from the near-grown to the very small, the elder ones already learning their parts in the life of the family, the boys their letters and their figures and the beginnings of their father's trade, the girls the running of a household at their mother's side, and the little ones still in the care of the nurse or the maid, the youngest perhaps still in the cradle or the small box bed. The children are a great part of the life and the warmth and the noise of the house, and a great part of its hopes and its fears too, for in this age a child's hold on life was uncertain, and the love a parent bore. A child was shadowed always by the knowledge of how easily it might be lost, the more so this particular winter, with the faint talk of sickness in the air, though the parents put that thought aside, as parents must, and love and tend their children and trust them to God, and the household is completed by its servants, for a family of this standing kept servants, though not the great staff of a noble house, but a maid or two, and perhaps a man, the indoor servants who did the labour of the home, the cooking and the cleaning and the carrying and the fetching, under the goodwife's eye. They were often young, these servants, girls from the country or from poorer families of the town, taken into service for their keep and a small fee, living as part of the household, sleeping in the kitchen or a truckle bed in a corner, sharing the family's life at close quarters in the crowded house, for there was little room for separation in a dwelling of this kind, and master and servant lived side by side, the servants very nearly members of the family, present at its meals and its prayers and its daily life, bound into the household in the intimate way of a home where all lived together in a few snug rooms at the top of a tall stone stair. This then is the household, the merchant and his good wife, their children, their servants, gathered now in the cosy hall on the winter's evening, and it is their ordinary night that we have come to share. Let us think, while the family settles by the fire, of the day's work that lies behind this evening, of the trade that supported the house and gave the merchant his standing, for the comfort of the home was built on the labour of the booth, and the merchant's day, now ending, had been spent at his trade down on the high street. The booth was the merchant's shop and counting house and place of business, one of the little locked shops that crowded along the high street and about the kirk of St. Giles, the Lucken booths as they were called, the locked booths, narrow, dark, cramped places where the goods were kept and sold and the business done, and there the merchant had passed his day, as he passed all his working days, at the trade by which he lived. And the trade of an Edinburgh merchant in this age was the trade of the whole wide world, or as much of it as reached the cold northern kingdom, for though Scotland was a small and a poor country, set at the edge of things, its merchants reached out over the seas to the great trading lands beyond, and through the port of Leith below the city flowed the goods of half of Europe and more. They sent out the rough goods of Scotland, the wool, and the hides and the coarse cloth, the salt fish and the coal, the plain produce of a poor hard country, and they brought back in exchange the finer goods that Scotland could not make, the wine of France, with which the Scots had traded and allied for centuries, the fine cloth of the Low Countries, the timber and the iron of the Baltic lands, the spices and the silks and the luxuries of the wider world, and 100 other things, and the merchant dealt in these, buying and selling, importing and exporting, his goods coming and going through Leith in the ships that braved the cold North Sea, his fortune made on the turn of the trade. It was a chancy business, and a careful one, for the seas were dangerous and the ships were small, and the voyages long and perilous, and a cargo lost to storm or to the pirates and privateers that haunted the seas could ruin a man, and the merchant lived always with the risk of it. The fortune ventured on the sea, and the anxious waiting for the ship to come safe to port. And this winter there was a new shadow over the trade, the faintest of shadows but real, for it was through the ships and the ports that sickness travelled, carried from the infected lands over the sea, and a wise merchant in a year when plague was spoken of watched the news from the ports with a particular care, where the ships came from, what was heard of sickness in the trading towns abroad, whether any vessel had been turned away or held in quarantine, for the trade that brought the wealth might also, in a bad year, bring the pestilence, and the merchant knew it, and listened to the talk of the harbour with half an ear cocked for trouble. But there was no certain trouble yet, only the rumour, and the trade went on, and the merchant had passed his day at it as on any other day. And now the day's work was done, the booth shut up and locked against the night, the goods secured, the accounts set by, the merchant climbed home up the dark close to his warm house and his waiting family, as he climbed each evening when the day's trade was over. There was a rhythm to it, the merchant's day, down to the booth in the morning, the day passed at the trade, the climb home in the winter dark to the fire and the supper and the family, and it was the rhythm of his life and of his city. The working day on the high street and the evening at home up the close, the trade and the household, the booth and the fire, the two halves of the merchant's world. And tonight the day's trade done and the booth shut, he is home, in the cosy hall, by the fire, with his good wife and his children about him, the labour of the day behind him, the still evening ahead, and whatever shadows lay over the trade and the city, here, in the bright circle of the firelight, with his family safe about him, there was peace and comfort and home. Let us follow the merchant's trade out beyond the city, down to the port of Leith and the sea beyond, for the wealth of the house came from the sea and the wide trade across it, and the connection of the crowded land-locked seeming ridge to the oceans beyond is worth our seeing. For Edinburgh, though it stood on its ridge a little back from the water, was a sea city, its life bound to the sea through its port of Leith, the harbour town on the firth a mile or two below the city, where the ships came and went, and the trade of the burgh flowed in and out. Leith was the gate of Edinburgh to the seas, the harbour where the ships tied up, the warehouses where the goods were stored, the place where the merchants' cargoes came in from across the sea and went out to it, the busy salt-smelling harbour town that was the city's window on the wide world of the oceans. And through Leith flowed the trade that made the merchants' wealth, the goods coming and going across the cold northern seas. Out went the rough goods of Scotland, the wool and the hides and the coarse cloth, the salt fish and the coal and the salt, the plain produce of a poor hard country, carried in the small wooden ships over the dangerous seas to the trading lands beyond. And in came the goods that Scotland could not make or grow, the riches of the wider world, the wine of France above all, for the Scots and the French had traded and allied for centuries, and the wine of Bordeaux came cheap to Scotland, the claret that the Scots loved, the fine cloth of the Low Countries, the linen and the woolens of Flanders and Holland, the timber and the iron and the tar of the Baltic lands, the goods of Norway and Sweden and the Eastern Sea, the spices and the silks and the sugar and the luxuries of the farther world, brought through the great trading ports and on to Scotland. The merchant dealt in these, his cargoes coming and going through Leith, his wealth made on the turn of the wide sea trade. It was a chancy and a perilous trade, the sea trade of the age, for the ships were small and wooden, and the seas were wide and dangerous, the storms of the northern oceans terrible, the voyages long and uncertain, and a cargo ventured on the sea might be lost to storm or wreck, or taken by the pirates and privateers that haunted the trading routes, and a merchant might be ruined by the loss of a ship, as he might be made by its safe return. So the merchant lived with the risk of the sea, the fortune ventured on the water, the anxious waiting for the ship to come safe to port, the news of storms and wrecks and losses, the whole chancy perilous business of the sea trade on which his wealth depended. And this winter there was the new shadow over the trade, the faint dread of the sickness, for it was through the ships and the ports that the pestilence travelled, carried from the infected lands over the sea. And a merchant in a year of rumoured plague watched the ships and the ports with a particular anxious care where the vessels came from, what was heard of sickness in the trading towns abroad, whether any ship had been turned away or held for fear of what it carried, for the trade that brought the wealth might also, in a bad year, bring the terror. But this winter the trade went on, the ships coming and going through Leith, the merchants' cargoes venturing on the sea and coming safe to port, the wealth flowing in that supported the cosy house and the comfortable family on the ridge above, and had connected them, the trade, the family in their snug room to the world beyond, the wine they drank from France, the cloth they wore from Flanders, the very luxuries of their comfortable home brought over the dangerous seas through the busy port below, the crowded land-bound ridge, bound by its trade to the wide world of the oceans and the trading lands beyond. The merchant in his warm house was a man of the wider lands, his trade reaching out across the seas, his wealth made on the turn of the ocean trade, and the comfort of his home was built on the ships that came and went through Leith, the wide sea trade that brought the riches of the earth to the cold northern city. This winter's night, as the family slept snug in the house that the sea trade had built, let us turn to the country round the city, of the land beyond the walls from which the city drew its food and its fuel and its life. For the crowded city did not feed itself, but drew its sustenance from the country round, and the connection of the city to its hinterland is worth our seeing. For a city, even a small one, is a heavy consumer, drawing in food and fuel and goods from the country about it, and Edinburgh, on its crowded ridge, drew its life from the farms and the fields and the mosses and the pits of the country round, the daily flow of provisions in from the hinterland that fed the crowded city. The food came in from the country, the grain from the farms, the oats above all that were the staff of Scottish life, grown in the fields of the lowland country and brought into the city's markets, the meat from the herds and flocks of the country, the cattle and the sheep driven into the flesh market, the produce of the farms, the dairy goods, the fowls, the eggs, the vegetables, the kale, the daily provision of the city's food brought in from the country round to feed the crowded ridge. And the fuel came in too, for the city burned much fuel against the cold, and it all came from the country round, the peat cut from the mosses and the bogs of the country, and brought into the city, but the chief fuel of the Scottish fire, and the coal dug from the pits of the country round, for the country about Edinburgh was rich in coal, the coal pits that supplied the city's fires, the coal brought in to feed the hearths of the crowded ridge. The peat and the coal together were the fuel of the city, both brought in from the country round, the daily flow of fuel in to feed the 1,000 fires of the crowded city, the warmth of the houses drawn from the mosses and the pits of the hinterland. And the water even came in good part from beyond the crowded ridge, brought to the public wells from the springs of the country round, piped into the cisterns that fed the wells where the people drew their water, the city's water drawn from the springs beyond the town. The whole life of the crowded city then, its food and its fuel and its water, was drawn from the country round, the daily flow of provisions and fuel and water into the crowded ridge, the city living on the produce of its hinterland, the farms and the mosses and the pits and the springs of the country round, sustaining the crowded life of the city. And the markets of the high street were the meeting place of the city and the country, the place where the produce of the country came in to feed the city, the country folk bringing in their goods to the markets, the city drawing in its sustenance from the country round, the daily exchange of the city and its hinterland carried on in the markets of the broad street. And the family in their warm house lived on this daily flow from the country, the oats and the meat and the produce in their supper, drawn from the farms of the country round, the peat and the coal in their fire, cut from the mosses and dug from the pits of the hinterland, the water in their pots carried up from the wells that drew from the springs beyond the town, the comfort of their home drawn through the markets and the trade of the city from the country round about. They lived in the crowded city, on its ridge, but their life was fed from the country beyond, the daily flow of food and fuel and water in from the hinterland, sustaining the crowded life of the ridge, the city and the country bound together in the daily exchange that fed the town. And tonight the family slept fed and warm on the produce of the country round, the food of the farms in their bellies, the fuel of the mosses and the pits glowing in their banked fire, the water of the country springs in their house, the crowded city sustained by the country round, sleeping safe on its ridge, the family safe and fed and warm this winter's night, on the daily provision drawn from the land beyond the walls, in the cosy house on the crowded ridge above the cold northern country. We have come to the city in the dark of the winter evening, when the street was emptying and the houses shutting up, but let us think for a while of the high street by day, of the bright crowded public life of the broad street that was the heart of the city, for the merchant's day was spent there, and the life of the burgh flowed along it, and it was a sight and a scene like no other. By day the High Street was the busiest place in Scotland, the broad steep way crowded from end to end with the life and the trade and the business of the city, the people thronging, the booths open, the markets in full cry, the whole bright, loud, crowded commercial civic life of the burgh played out along the one great street. The trade of the city centred on the street and the kirk of St. Giles that stood in the midst of it, for about the kirk and along the street were crowded the booths and the stalls and the markets where the buying and selling of the city was done. There were the luccan booths, the locked booths, the little permanent shops that crowded against the very walls of the kirk and down the middle of the street, where the merchants kept their goods, the cramped dark shops of the better trade. There were the cramies, the lighter stalls and booths set up about the kirk, the smaller traders' places. And there were the markets, the open markets held in their appointed places along the street, each trade and each kind of goods to its own place. The meal market and the flesh market and the fish market and the rest. The country folk come in to sell their produce, the buying and selling and haggling and crying of the markets filling the street with noise and bustle and life. And the street was the stage of the city's public life as well as its trade, the place where the public business of the burgh was done. Here stood the toll booth, the heart of the burgh's government, council house and court and prison all in one, the grim old building where the town council met, and the courts sat, and the prisoners were held. Here stood the market cross, the chief civic monument where the proclamations were read, the royal proclamations and the burgh's own, cried aloud to the gathered people, where the public ceremonies were held and the public punishments done, the heart of the civic life of the burgh. Here the processions passed, the entries of kings and the funerals of the great and the civic ceremonies of the burgh. Here the people gathered for the public business and the public spectacle. The High Street was the forum of the city, the place where its public life came together. The trade and the government and the ceremony and the crowd all met along the one broad steep street. It was a crowded, noisy, vivid, intense scene, the High Street by day, the press of the people, the cry of the markets, the bustle of the trade, the life of the city concentrated along the one street, and the merchant moved through it daily, to and from his booth, part of the crowded commercial life of the burgh, knowing the street and its people and its trade as he knew his own home. And then, as the short winter day failed and the dark came down, the street emptied, the booths shut up and locked, the markets ended, the crowds dispersed up the closes to their homes, and the great bright crowded street fell still and dark, the public life of the day giving way to the private life of the evening, the merchants climbing home up the dark, closes to their fires and their families, the high street left dark and empty under the winter night. The daily tide of the city's life ebbed away from the street into the tall shut houses where the people gathered close against the dark. And it was up one of those dark closes from the emptying street that the merchant climbed home tonight, leaving the day's trade behind him on the street to the shut house and the waiting family, the bright public day giving way to the still private evening, the street to the fire, the trade to the home. Consider the merchant's place in the world of the burgh, for he was not merely a private trader, but a member of a proud and an ordered civic community. The burgh of Edinburgh, with its own government and its own ranks and its own intense corporate life. And the merchant's standing in that community was a great part of who he was. For the burgh was a self-governing community, a corporation, with its own council and its own officers and its own laws and privileges, governing itself under the crown, ordering its own affairs, the proud independent civic body that ran the city. And at the head of the burgh's life stood the merchants, the merchant class, the traders who had the freedom of the burgh, the burgesses, the full members of the civic community with the right to trade and the right to a share in the government of the town, the merchants, the chief men of the burgh, the rulers and the leaders of the civic community. For the burgh was governed by its council, the provost and the bailies and the council, drawn in good part from the merchant class, the prosperous traders who ran the affairs of the town, and to be a merchant burgess was to have a place, at least in principle, in the government of the city, a share in the ordering of the burgh's affairs, a standing in the civic community. And the merchants were organised in their guild, the merchant guild, the proud corporation of the traders, with its own privileges and its own discipline and its own corporate life, the guild that ordered the trade and protected the merchants' interests and bound them together in a proud corporate body. And below the merchants stood the craftsmen, the tradesmen, organised in their own incorporations, their own guilds of the various crafts, the hammermen and the websters and the cordoners and the rest, the craft guilds with their own privileges and their own place in the burgh, below the merchants, but proud and organised and part of the civic community. It was an ordered, hierarchical, intensely corporate world, the burgh, the merchants above and the craftsmen below, each in their guilds and incorporations, the community ordered and ranked and bound together in the proud corporate life of the self-governing burgh. And the merchant had his place in it, his standing as a burgess and a member of the merchant guild, his share in the civic community, his rank in the ordered world of the burgh, and his standing was a great part of who he was, not merely a private trader, but a member of a proud civic community, a burgess of Edinburgh, with all the standing and the privilege and the responsibility that the title carried. The freedom of the burgh was valued, hard to gain and proudly held, the mark of full membership in the civic community, and the merchant burgess was a man of standing in his city, part of the ruling community of the proud self-governing town. And there is something worth feeling in the corporate civic pride of it, the proud ordered community of the burgh, so different from the loose private life of a modern city, the intense corporate belonging, the guild and the incorporation and the burgess-ship, the proud self-governing community of which the merchant was a member. He belonged, the merchant, to a community, to the burgh and the guild, was bound into the proud corporate life of his city, had his place and his standing and his share in the ordered civic world, and that belonging was a great part of his identity and his security, the proud civic community that held him and that he helped to rule. And in a year of trouble, of war and rumoured sickness, the corporate community took on a particular weight, for the burgh faced its troubles together. As a community, the council ordering the city's defence and its provision, and should the worst come, its measures against the plague, the proud corporate community meeting the troubles of the times together. But that was the future, and tonight the merchant slept secure in his standing, a burgess of Edinburgh, a member of the proud civic community, his place in the ordered world of the burgh secure, the proud self-governing city sleeping about him, the corporate community at its rest, the merchant safe in his standing and his belonging this winter's night. In the warm house on the ridge, a man of the proud old burgh of Edinburgh. Let us draw close to the fire, for the fire is the heart of the house, and on a Scottish winter's night the fire was everything, the source of all the warmth, and much of the light and the very centre around which the life of the household gathered. The fireplace is a wide one, set in the thick stone of the gable wall, a great hooded chimney drawing the smoke up and away, and in it burns the fire that is never quite let to die through all the cold months, banked low at night and built up again at dawn, fed through the day with peat and with coal, for Edinburgh burned both, the peat cut from the mosses beyond the town, and the coal dug from the pits of the country round, and the mingled smoke of the two, the sweet brown reek of the peat, and the heavier smell of the coal, was the very breath of the city in winter, hanging low over the ridge in a brown pall that gave the town its old by-name of Old Reekie, the old smoky one. And the fire was not merely for warmth, but for the work of the house, for it was over this same fire that the food was cooked. The pots hung from the great iron chimney crook, or set on the glowing peats, the girdle heated for the oatcakes, the labour of the kitchen carried on at the one hearth, so that the fire was at once the warmth and the kitchen and the light and the gathering place of the home, the single burning heart from which all the comfort of the house flowed. The good wife and her maids tended it with care, for a fire was precious and dangerous, precious for all it gave, and dangerous for the ever-present fear of its spreading. The terror of fire in a city of tall timber-fronted houses crowded cheek by jowl, where a blaze in one land might leap to the next, and run through a whole close before it could be checked, so that the tending and the banking and the watching of the fire was a constant careful labour, the good warmth always shadowed by the lurking fear. But tonight the fire is well tended and safe, and it throws its red light and its good heat out across the fire-lit room, and the family gathers close about it, for in the cold of a Scottish winter the warmth of the fire reached only so far, and beyond its glow the room fell away cold toward the shuttered windows and the thick stone walls, so that the household drew in close to the hearth, into the circle of its warmth and its light, the way people had gathered about the fire since the beginning of time. There is a deep old comfort in it, the gathering about the winter fire, that we have half lost in our age of even warmth at the turn of a dial, the drawing in close to the one source of heat and light in the surrounding cold and dark, the faces lit red by the flames, the backs turned to the cold room behind, the family pressed near into the small bright circle of the firelight, while the winter night pressed black and cold against the shutters without, and the fire gave the house its light as well as its warmth, for in this age and this place the dark of the winter night was held back by flame alone, and the flame was precious. There were candles, tallow candles for the most part, of rendered fat, that smoked and guttered and stank a little and had to be tended and trimmed, and the better wax candles kept for special use, but candles cost money and were not burned freely, and much of the light of the evening came from the fire itself, the red glow of the peats and the coals throwing its uncertain light across the room, so that the family lived its winter evenings in a dim ruddy light, the firelight and a candle or two, the corners of the room sunk in shadow, the faces lit close and warm about the hearth, the evening passed in the soft, dim glow of flame that was the only light the age could give. It was a dimmer world than ours, the world of the firelit evening, and a smaller one, drawn close about the hearth, but there was a deep warmth and a deep intimacy in it. The family gathered in the small circle of light and heat against the cold dark of the northern winter night, and it is into that warm, close circle that we have come tonight, to sit with them by the fire, and share the quiet evening, and watch the flames. Let us think, while the family sleeps snug, of the cold against which all this warmth was raised, for the Scottish winter was a hard and a serious matter, and the life of the house in winter was shaped by the war against the cold, and to understand the comfort of the fire-lit room you must understand the cold beyond it. The winter in the old grey city was long and dark and bitter, the days short, the nights long, the light failing by mid-afternoon and lingering late in the morning, so that for the depth of the winter the people lived much of their lives in the dark. The brief grey days bracketed by the long dark evenings and the dark mornings. And it was cold, truly cold, the cold coming raw off the North Sea and down from the hills, the wind cutting through the closes and round the tall lands, the frost hard on the causeway, the snow on the high crags above the town, the city gripped through the months in the hard cold of the northern winter. And against that cold the house was the shelter, the snug shut shell raised against the weather, and the keeping of the warmth was a constant labour and a constant care. The fire was the heart of it, the fire that was never let to die through the cold months, banked low at night and built up at dawn, fed through the day with the peat and the coal. The warmth of it, the difference between comfort and misery, between life and death even, for it killed the very old and the very young and the poor and the sick, in a hard winter, dying of it in the unwarmed houses, so that the fire and the warmth it gave were not luxuries but necessities, the keeping of the fire a serious and a vital labour. And the house was shut against the cold, the shutters barred, the doors closed, the draughts stopped as well as they could be, the close air kept in and the cold kept out, the whole dwelling sealed and warmed against the weather, a close-shut shell on the cold dark ridge. And the people dressed against the chill, indoors as well as out, for the houses, snug as they were kept by the fire, were not heated as our houses are, the warmth reaching only so far from the hearth, the rooms cold beyond the fire's glow, so that the people wore warm clothing indoors, the wool and the plaid and the layers, the warm Scottish wool that was the defence against the cold, and they drew into the fire, and they slept in the close-shut box beds, and they lived their winter lives in the small snug circles of the firelight against the cold of the surrounding rooms, and the greater cold of the night beyond. It was a life lived closer to the cold than ours, the winter life of the old town, the cold always there, always pressing, held back only by the fire and the wool and the shut house, never wholly banished as we banish it, a constant presence to be guarded against, and endured and retreated from into the small refuges of fire and bed. There is something in it, the closeness to the chill, that deepens the comfort of the firelit room, for the warmth meant more because the cold was real and near and dangerous, the fire more precious, the deep bed more welcome, the shut house more of a refuge, the comfort of the home sharpened and deepened by the hardness of the cold it held at bay. We who banish the cold at the turn of a dial have lost something of that, the deep meaning of warmth in a freezing world, the preciousness of the fire and the warm bed and the shut house, the comfort that is comfort precisely because the cold is real and near. The family sleeping warm in their box beds tonight knew the cold, lived close to it all the winter, guarded against it daily, and their warmth was the sweeter for it. The close-shut house on the cold dark ridge, the fire banked and glowing, the family close and cosy against the bitter northern night, the deep old comfort of warmth in the cold that we can still feel, faintly, down the centuries, as we sit with them in the warm room and listen to the cold wind in the close beyond the barred shutters. Now to the dark, and to the light that held it back. For the people of this age lived with a darkness we can hardly imagine, and the light against it was precious and laborious, and the life of the winter evening was shaped by the simple fact that the dark could be held back only by flame. For it was, in the deep of the northern winter, dark for the greater part of the day and night, the short days bracketed by the long dark evenings and the dark mornings, the people living much of their lives, through the winter, in the dark or the half-dark, and against that great darkness they had only the fire and the candle, the flame that was the only light the age could give. And the flame was precious, for it cost labour and money to make, and was not to be wasted. The candles were the chief made light, and they were of two kinds, the tallow candles for the common use, made of rendered animal fat, that smoked and guttered and stank a little, and had to be tended and trimmed, the cheap light of the everyday, and the wax candles, finer and cleaner and dearer, kept for special use, the better light of the better occasions. And the candles cost money, the tallow cheap but not free, the wax dear, and a careful household did not burn its candles freely, but used them with care, lighting only what was needed, putting them out when the light was not wanted, eking out the precious flame against the dark of the winter. And much of the light of the evening came not from the candle but from the fire itself, the red glow of the peat and the coal throwing its uncertain ruddy light across the room, the firelight that was warmth and light at once, the chief illumination of the winter evening, the family living its evenings in the dim ruddy glow of the fire, the candle lit only when more light was needed, the precious flame spent with care. It was a dim world then, the world of the winter evening, lit by the firelight and the careful candle, the room sunk in shadow beyond the small circle of the flame, the people living their evenings in the soft, dim, uncertain light of fire and candle, so different from our own bright, steady, abundant light at the turn of a switch. And the dark beyond the light was a real and a present dark, the dark of the unlit rooms beyond the fire, the dark of the night beyond the shutters, the dark of the winter night pressing close against the small lit circle of the home, the people living always at the edge of it, the flame holding it back only so far, the blackness real and near and pressing, held off only by the precious uncertain light of the flame. And there is something in it, the living pack to the night, that deepens the meaning of the light, for the light meant more because the blackness was real and near, the flame more precious, the lit room more of a refuge against the surrounding dark. We who banish the dark at the turn of a switch have lost something of that, the deep meaning of light in a dark world, the preciousness of the flame, the small lit circle against the dark. The family in their warm room, lit by the firelight and the careful candle, lived close to the night, held it back with the precious flame, gathered into the small lit circle of the home against the dark of the winter night, and their light was the sweeter for the dark it held at bay, the ruddy firelit room a refuge of light against the surrounding dark, the precious flame holding back the night. And tonight, as the family sleeps, the last candle is out, the fire banked low, the snug room sunk into the dark, the precious flame spent and saved for the morning, the household sleeping in the shut snug house, the deep of the winter night holding the sleeping city, the small lit circle of the evening gone black now with the rest, the family sleeping in the warm shut house against the cold, the precious light put by until the cold dawn should call for it again. Now the supper is cooking, and the smell of it fills the cosy room, and let us turn to the food of the house, for the table of a prosperous Edinburgh family in this age was a particular matter, plain and hearty and rooted in the cold hard country that produced it, and worth our knowing. The foundation of all eating in Scotland was the grain, and above all the oat, for the oat grew where finer grains would not, in the cold wet northern ground, and the oat was the staff of Scottish life eaten in 100 forms, The oatmeal made into the porridge that began the day, into the oatcakes baked hard on the girdle over the fire, into the brose and the gruel and the bannocks, the plain oaten fare that fed the whole country from the poorest cotter to the merchant at his board. Bread of wheat there was, for those who could afford it, the finer white bread a mark of some prosperity, but the oat was the true bread of Scotland, and the oatcake and the porridge were on every table, the merchant's no less than the poor man's, the plain grey honest food of the north. And with the grain there was the kale, the coarse green Scottish cabbage that grew through the hardest weather, and was the great vegetable of the country, so much so that the word kale came to mean the midday meal, the kale pot ever on the fire, the broth of kale and barley, and what meat or bones could be had, simmering away to make the thick sustaining pottage that was the heart of the Scottish dinner. There was meat for a prosperous family, though not in the lavish quantity of the rich south, the beef and the mutton of the Scottish herds, often salted down for the winter, the barrel of salt beef a great standby of the cold months, and the poultry, and in season the game, and the fish above all, for Scotland was a country of long coasts and rich seas, and fish was plentiful and cheap and eaten much, the herring and the haddock and the cod, fresh from the firth or dried and salted for the winter store. There was the produce of the dairy, the milk and the butter and the cheese, and there were the plain roots and pulses, the barley and the peas, and the few fruits the cold country gave, and the imported luxuries the merchants' trade could supply, the wine of France above all, for the Scots loved their claret and the trade with France brought it cheap, and the spices and the dried fruits and the sugar that came from abroad to grace the table of those who could pay. The supper itself, the evening meal, was the lighter meal of the day, for the dinner at midday was the chief meal and the supper a simpler thing, but in a prosperous house it was a good meal all the same, the kyle or the broth, the oatcakes and the bread, the cheese and the butter, perhaps a dish of fish, or the cold remains of the dinner's meat, the ale to drink. For ale was the common drink of all, brewed in the house or bought from the brewster, drunk by everyone at every meal, and perhaps the wine for the master, and it was eaten together, the household at the one board, the family and the servants too, in a house of this kind, all gathered at the table in the firelit room, the food plain and hearty and sufficient, the eating unhurried, the talk quiet, the meal a gathering of the household at the close of the day. And the meal began, as everything in that godly household began, with grace the saying of the blessing over the food, the bowing of the heads, the giving of thanks to God for the provision of the table, for these were devout people in a devout age and a devout country, and the food was received as God's gift and acknowledged so, the grace before the meat and the thanks after, the household joining in the brief solemn ritual that hallowed the plain meal and bound the eating to the faith that ran through each part of their lives. There was, perhaps, this particular winter, an added weight to the grace, an added earnestness in the giving of thanks for safety and provision and health, with the talk of sickness in the air and the year uncertain. For a family that heard the distant rumour of plague gave thanks the more fervently for the present mercies of a full board and a healthy household and a snug safe home, and prayed the more earnestly for the continuance of them. But the grace said, the household fell to and ate the plain good food of the north, in the firelit room, by the fire, on the winter's night, the simple deep comfort of a shared meal in a safe home 400 years ago. Consider how the household fed itself through the winter, of the stored food and the provisioning, for the feeding of a family through the hard cold months was a serious labour and a serious skill, and the stores laid by against the winter were a measure of a household's care and prosperity. For in this age, before the easy supply of food in all seasons that we know, the winter was a lean and a careful time, the fresh food of the warm seasons gone, the land yielding little, the seas dangerous, and a household lived through the winter, in good part on what it had stored up in the seasons of plenty, the provisions laid by in the autumn, against the hard months ahead, and the good wife's care in the laying in and the keeping of the stores was a vital part of the household's well-being. The great labour of the autumn was the laying in of the winter stores, the salting and the storing and the preserving of food against the cold months. There was the salting of the meat, the beef and the pork killed in the autumn and salted down in barrels, the salt beef that was the standby of the winter, the meat preserved against the months when no fresh meat could be had. There was the fish, the herring and the other fish salted and dried and stored, the salt fish a staple of the winter table. There was the grain, the meal and the malt laid in, the oatmeal that was the staff of life, stored in quantity against the winter. There was the preserving of what could be preserved, the fruits and the few stored vegetables, the cheese and the butter put by. The whole labour of the autumn bent toward the filling of the stores, the laying in of the food that would carry the household through the lean cold winter, and the well-stocked store was the household's security against the hard months. The prosperous, careful family laying in well against the winter, the poorer and the less careful facing the lean months with less. And through the winter the household lived on these stores, the good wife managing the provisions with care, drawing on the salted meat and the dried fish and the stored meal, eking out the stores through the cold months, supplementing them with what fresh food could be had. The winter kale that grew through the cold, the eggs and the milk of the household's own fowls and beasts if it kept any, the few things the winter market could supply. It was a careful management, the feeding of the household through the winter, the drawing on the stores, the making of the stored food into the meals of the cold months, the good wife's skill in feeding her family well through the lean time, and a well-managed household ate well enough through the winter on its stores, while a poorly managed one might go short before the spring. And there is something worth feeling in the care and the foresight of it, the laying in against the winter, the storing in the time of plenty against the time of want, the household's provision against the hard months, so different from our own easy supply of all foods in all seasons. The family lived closer to the cycle of plenty and want, of harvest and lean season, than we do, their winter feeding dependent on their autumn storing, their security in the cold months resting on the stores laid by in the warm, the rhythm of plenty and provision and careful management that fed the household through the year. And tonight, in the deep of the winter, the family ate from its stores, the salted meat and the stored meal made into the warm supper, the careful provision of the autumn feeding the household through the cold night, the well-stocked store, the security of the snug home against the lean cold winter, the good wife's care and foresight, feeding her family safe and well through the hard months, this winter's night, in the snug house on the ridge, the stored plenty of the autumn, snug in the bellies of the sleeping household against the cold dark of the northern winter night. Let us look about the house now, at the rooms and the things in them, for the home of a prosperous Edinburgh family in this age had its own particular character, plainer and harder than the soft comfort of a later time, but solid and warm and full of the things a careful family gathered about itself. The house, though tall, was not large in its rooms, for the tall lands of the old town packed many floors into a narrow space, and a family's dwelling might be a single floor of the land, or two, a few rooms only, in which the life of the household was lived close together. The chief room was the hall, where we sit now, the room of the fire, which served as kitchen and dining room and parlour, and the general gathering place of the family all at once. For in a dwelling of this kind the rooms were not divided to single uses as in a grander house, but served many purposes together, the hall, the warm heart, where most of the life went on. Off it lay the other rooms, the chamber where the master and his wife slept, perhaps a second chamber for the children, a small closet or two, and the kitchen quarters if the cooking was done apart, the whole dwelling a few rooms clustered together on the floor of the tall land, warm and close and crowded with the life of the family. The furnishing of the rooms was solid and dark and built to last. The heavy oak furniture of the age, made plain and strong and meant to serve a lifetime and be handed down. There was the board, the great table at which the family ate and the work of the house was done, and the benches and the stools and the few chairs about it, for chairs were still things of some dignity, not given to all. There was the kist, the great oak chest, the chief storage of the house, in which the linen and the clothes and the valuables were kept, often finely carved, a thing of value handed down through the family. There was the press, the cupboard, and the ormery, where the food and the plate were kept. There was the pewter, the plates and the dishes and the tankards of pewter that were the everyday vessels of a prosperous house, gleaming dully on the shelf or the plate rack, a measure of the family's standing. For pewter was the mark of comfort where the poor made do with wood and horn and the very rich had silver. And there were the smaller things, the comforts and the treasures, the few books, the Bible above all, and perhaps the psalm book and a godly work or two, for a literate godly family kept its books, the candlesticks, the few pieces of silver if the family ran to them, the bits of finer cloth, the small accumulated goods of a careful, prosperous home. The walls might be bare stone or panelled in dark wood, the panelling a mark of some comfort, or hung with the painted cloths that served the middling sort where the rich had tapestry coarse cloths painted with patterns or scenes or godly mottos that covered the cold stone and gave the room some colour and warmth. The floors were of board, strewn perhaps with a little dried herb or rush in the old fashion, or bare and scrubbed. The small deep windows, set in the thick stone walls, were shuttered with wooden shutters within, for glass was costly, and the windows often only partly glazed, the lower half shuttered, and the upper glazed, so that the shutters were closed against the cold and the dark of the winter night, sealing the warm room against the weather, and over it all the dim light of the fire and the candles, the room close and warm and crowded with the solid dark furniture, and the gleaming pewter, and the gathered goods of the family, a plain, hard, comfortable home, built to keep out the cold and hold in the warmth, the dwelling of a careful, prosperous family in the cold northern city. There is something I find worth feeling in the plainness and the solidity of it, the hard, plain comfort of the house, so different from the soft abundance of a later age, for these were people who lived closer to the cold and the dark and the hardness of things than we do, and their comfort was a harder one and a plainer thing, the solid oak and the gleaming pewter and the good fire, the few treasured books and the painted cloth on the wall, the shutters barred against the winter, the close room at the top of the cold stair. It was enough, and more than enough, for a family of that age, the plain solid warmth of it, the home gathered close and cosy against the cold dark of the northern winter, and there is a deep old comfort in it still, the plain hard cosiness of the firelit room with its dark oak and its barred shutters, the cosy safe shell of the home in the cold, that we can feel across the centuries as we sit here with them, in the cosy hall, on the winter's night, in the tall stone house on the ridge. Let us look at how the family dressed, for the clothing of a prosperous Edinburgh family in this age had its own character, plain and stout and sober, shaped by the cold climate and the godly temper of the city, and worth our seeing. The first thing that shaped the dress was the cold, for in the hard northern climate the clothing was above all a defence against the weather, thick and heavy, and made to keep out the cold. The wool, that was the material of Scottish dress, the woolen cloth woven from the wool of the Scottish sheep, made into the stout garments that the cold demanded. The people wore wool, layers of it, the thick woolen clothing that was the defence against the bitter cold of the northern winter, indoors as well as out, for the houses were cold beyond the fire, and the heavy wool was worn within doors as without, the family wrapped warm in their woolen garments against the cold of the rooms and the greater cold of the streets. And the second matter that shaped the dress was the godly sober temper of the city. For the reformed Scots were a sober people, plain in their dress as in their lives, suspicious of finery and display and vanity, and the dress of a godly family was plain and sober and dark, without the bright colours and the rich ornament, and the display of vainer lands and times. The merchant dressed in the sober dark clothing of his kind, the dark woolen suit, plain and good and well made but without display, the sober dress of a grave and godly man of business, the dark coat and breeches, the plain linen, the sober bearing of a merchant burgess. His good wife dressed in the sober dress of a godly matron, the dark woolen gown, plain and stout and decent, the linen cap and collar, the sober modest dress of a respectable wife, without the finery and the display that the kirk frowned on, the plain decent clothing of a godly woman. And the children were dressed likewise, plainly and warmly and decently, in the sober dress of a godly family, warm against the cold and plain against vanity. But plain and sober did not mean poor or mean, for this was a prosperous family, and their dress, though plain, was good, the wool fine and well woven, the linen good, the garments well made and well kept, the dress of comfort and standing, though not of display. There was good cloth, the fine wool and the good linen, the better materials that a prosperous family could afford, and there were the marks of standing, modest but real, the quality of the cloth, the goodness of the making, the few permitted ornaments, the dress that spoke of comfort and respectability, though not of vain display. And there were the imported fine cloths that the merchant's trade could supply, the fine linen of the Low Countries, the good woolen cloth, the materials brought from abroad to clothe a prosperous family well, the trade that brought the wine and the luxuries, bringing also the good cloth for the family's dress. The family dressed then, plainly but well, soberly, but with the quality of comfort, the good woolen clothing of a prosperous godly family, defence against the cold and mark of standing both, plain against vanity and good against meanness, the sober comfortable dress of the merchant's household. And the clothing, like so much of the household's life, was the work of the women's hands in good part, for the spinning and the sewing and the making and the mending of clothes was a great part of the endless handwork of the women of the house, the good wife, and the maids at the spinning and the sewing, the making of the garments and the constant mending and keeping of them, the clothing of the family in good part, home-made and home-kept, the women's handwork clothing the household. And the clothes were valued and kept and handed down, for cloth was costly, and garments were not lightly replaced, the good woolen clothing kept and mended and made to last, and passed down through the family. The clothes a valued part of the household's goods, kept in the kist, handed down, made to serve. So the family dressed, plain and cosy and sober and good, in the warm woolen clothing of their cold northern city, and their godly sober temper, wrapped warm against the cold, dressed plain against vanity, the sober comfortable dress of a prosperous godly Edinburgh family, this winter, in the close house on the ridge. Let us turn our notice to the servants of the house. For the comfort of the home rested in good part on their labour, and they are easy to overlook, and ought not to be. A merchant's household of this standing kept its servants, though not many, a maid or two, and perhaps a man or a boy, the indoor servants who did the rough and the constant labour of the home under the good wife's direction. They were young for the most part, the servants, girls and lads from poorer families of the town, or from the country round, taken into service for their keep and a small wage, and service was the common lot of the young poor, the way a girl or a boy of small family made their way in the world, working in the house of their betters, fed and housed and given a little money, learning the work and saving what they could against the day they might marry and keep a home of their own. And the labour they did was hard and constant, for keeping a house in this age was heavy work, done all by hand, without any of the 1,000 conveniences we take for granted. There was the fire to be tended, raked out and relit and fed through the day, the peat and the coal carried up the stair from the store below. There was the water to be fetched, and this was a great labour in the old town, for there was no water in the houses, none, and each drop used in the home had to be carried up from the public wells in the street, the water caddies bringing it up for a fee, or the servants themselves carrying it up the turnpike stair in stoops and pails, every drop for the cooking and the cleaning and the washing carried up by hand from the street far below, and the dirty water and the waste carried down again, or, in the way of the old town, flung from the window into the close beneath with the cry of warning. There was the cooking, over the one fire, the constant labour of the kitchen. There was the cleaning and the scouring and the washing, the scrubbing of the floors and the boards, the washing of the linen, the cleaning of the pewter. And there was the marketing, the fetching of the provisions from the booths and the markets of the high street, the whole heavy labour of the household, carried on by hand, by the servants under the good wife's eye, from before dawn until the family was abed. It was a hard life, the servant's life, the hours and the heavy work and the little rest, but it had its place in the intimate life of the household, for in a dwelling of this kind, a few rooms at the top of a stair, there was no separation of the servants into a distant world below stairs, as in a great house, but master and servant lived crowded together in the same rooms, sharing the same fire, the servants present at the family's meals and its prayers and its daily life, sleeping in the kitchen or on a truckle bed in a corner of the hall, bound into the household in the intimate way of a home where all lived together in a few snug rooms. The servant was very nearly a member of the family, sharing its life at close quarters, known and knowing, part of the household in a way that the servant of a grand house kept apart below stairs never was, and there was a closeness in it. For all the hardness of the labour and the plainness of the place, the household living together in the few close rooms, master and mistress and children and servants, gathered close in the firelight against the cold, dark night. And tonight the servants share the evening with the family, as they share all the life of the house, present in the cosy room, their day's labour drawing toward its close, the supper served and the household fed, the last tasks of the evening to be done before they too might rest, the banking of the fire, the setting of the house for the night, the small last labours of the day. They are part of the warm scene by the fire, the maid at her spinning or her mending in the corner, the lad about his last tasks bound into the household's evening as into its days, and we may notice them and grant them their place in the warm picture. The young servants who carried the water and tended the fire and did the heavy labour that made the comfort of the home, gathered now with the family in the firelit room at the close of the day, part of the household, part of the warmth, part of the quiet Scottish evening that we have come to share. Before the night ends, let us turn our notice to the youngest and the lowest of the household, the young maidservant, the girl who did the heaviest labour of the home, for she is the easiest to overlook, and there is a justice in giving her, across the long years, the attention that no one in her own time thought to give. She was a girl, very likely, of 15 or 16, from a poor family of the town, or from the country round, taken into service for her keep, and a small fee, one of the many young poor who made their way in the world by service in the houses of their betters, and she had come to this house to do the rough labour of it, the carrying and the cleaning and the fetching under the good wife's eye. Her day began before dawn, in the cold dark of the winter morning, when she rose from her bed in the kitchen, or her truckle in the corner to rake out and build up the fire, the first labour of the household's day, so that the house should be warm, and the fire ready when the family rose. And from that first fire her day ran on through the heavy labour of the home, the fetching of the water up the stair, the hardest of all her tasks, the climbing of the steep dark turnpike with the heavy stoops, again and again, for all the water the household used, the tending of the fire through the day, the cooking under the good wife's direction, the cleaning and the scouring and the washing, the scrubbing of the floors and the boards, the washing of the linen, the cleaning of the pewter, the marketing, the fetching of the provisions from the booths and markets of the street, the carrying down of the waste, flung from the window with the cry of warning, the whole heavy labour of the home, done by hand from before dawn until the family was abed, the hard days of the servant girl in the crowded house. And yet she was a girl, with a girl's heart and a girl's life going on beneath the labour, and it would be a poverty to see her only as the household's drudge. She had, perhaps, a fellow servant for company, another maid or a lad, the rough fellowship of the young servants in the household. She had her place in the close-knit life of the home, for in a dwelling of a few rooms the servant lived close among the family, present at its meals and its prayers and its evenings, very nearly a member of the household, known and knowing, bound into the family life in the intimate way of the crowded home. She had her faith, the plain devout faith of her people and her city, her place at the family worship, her prayers, her trust in God. She had her hopes of saving a little, of bettering her place, of marrying in time and keeping a home of her own, the modest hopes of a poor girl in service, the future she worked toward through the hard days. She had her rare rest, her place by the fire of an evening when the day's work was done, her share, however small, of the warmth and the comfort of the home. She was a whole person, this overlooked girl, as whole as any in the household, with as much within her, and the only difference between her and the children of the family she served was the accident of her poorer birth, the chance that had made her the servant rather than the served. And in a year of trouble, of war and rumoured sickness, her lot was the same as the household's, the same dread shared, the same trust in God, and, should the worst come, should the sickness fall upon the house, she would share that too, the servant close among the family in the crowded home, sharing its peril as she shared its life. But that was the future, and tonight she was safe and warm, her day's labour done, her place by the fire taken, part of the shut household gathered against the cold, the young maid-servant who carried the water and tended the fire and did the heavy labour that made the comfort of the home, resting now, this winter's night, in the fire-lit room she had helped to keep among the family she served, safe and snug in the sleeping house. Let her rest then, the servant girl by the banked fire, her hard day done, safe in the warm house on the winter's night, 400 years ago. Now the supper is eaten and cleared, and the household settles into the still evening, and let us see how they passed it, for the evening of a godly Edinburgh family in this age had its own shape and its own occupations, plainer and more devout than the evenings of a later and lighter time, but full of their own quiet comfort. The first thing to understand is that this was a deeply religious household, in a deeply religious city and country and age, and the faith ran through every part of the life, not as a thing apart, but as the very air they breathed, and the evening, like the day, was shaped by it. There was, in such a household, the daily worship of the family prayers, the gathering of the house, family and servants together, for the reading of the scriptures and the singing of a psalm and the offering of prayer, morning and evening, the head of the house leading his household before God as he was bound to do, the whole company gathered in the warm room about the book. And so a part of the evening was given to this, the family worship, the merchant taking up the great Bible, the family Bible that was the chief treasure, and the chief book of the house, and reading aloud a portion of the scripture to the gathered household, the grave words filling the firelit room, the family and the servants listening, the children hushed, the firelight on the pages and the listening faces, and then the psalm, for the singing of the psalms was the great music of the Scottish kirk and the Scottish home, the metrical psalms sung to their plain strong tunes, the household joining in, the old words of comfort and praise and supplication rising in the warm room, the psalm that was the voice of the people's faith, sung in the kirk on the Sabbath, and in the home of an evening, the grave sweet plain music of the Scottish psalm filling the firelit room, and then the prayer, the head of the house praying aloud for the household, for the family and the servants, for the kirk and the cause and the troubled land, for health and safety and the mercy of God. The whole company bowed in the snug room, the day's worship offered before they slept. It was the heart of the evening, the family worship, the daily turning of the household to God, and it gave the evening its grave sweet centre, the faith that ran through all their lives gathered into the quiet ritual by the fire. But the evening was not all worship, for there was time too for the quieter ordinary occupations of a family at home, the talk and the work and the rest. The goodwife and the maid sat at their handwork, the spinning and the sewing and the mending, the endless handwork of women that filled the idle hours, the wheel turning, the needle going, the useful work that was never done. The merchant might cast up his accounts or read, for a literate godly man had his books, Bible above all, but perhaps a godly work or two, a book of sermons, a treatise of divinity, the plain serious reading of a serious age. The children played their small games, or learned their letters, or listened to the talk of their elders. And there was talk, the soft talk of a family at home, of the day's doings, of the trade, of the neighbours, of the news of the city and the war and the troubled times, the circling familiar talk of people who had the evening before them and no need to fill it, gathered in the firelight, the talk going on, the work going on, the fire burning down, the northern night passing. There is a deep settled comfort in the picture of it, the godly family at its evening, the worship and the work and the talk, the Bible read and the psalm sung and the prayer offered, the handwork and the small games and the circling talk, the household gathered close in the cosy firelit room against the cold dark night, the evening passed in the plain devout comfortable way of their age and their faith. It was a graver evening than ours, and a plainer, and a more devout, but it had its own deep comfort, the comfort of the gathered household, the shared faith, the calm occupations, the cosy room, the fire, the quiet northern night passing in the company of those one loved, under the eye of the God one trusted, in the warm safe shell of the home. And it is into that quiet, devout, comfortable evening that we have come tonight, to sit by the fire with the godly family, and hear the Bible read and the psalm sung, and watch the handwork and listen to the talk, and share the still Scottish evening, 400 years ago, in the warm room at the top of the dark stair. Let us think more deeply of the faith that ran through this household and this city. For Edinburgh in this age was a godly city, in a godly country, at a peculiarly godly moment, and the religion of the people shaped their lives in ways we can hardly imagine, and the family by the fire were children of that faith through and through. Scotland had passed the century before through the upheaval of the Reformation, and had come out of it with a church and a faith of a particular and a powerful kind, the Reformed Presbyterian Kirk, stern and serious and deeply rooted in the lives of the people, and the Scots had become a people of the Book and the Kirk and the Sabbath, their whole lives ordered by their religion to a degree that set them apart even in a religious age. The heart of it was the Kirk, the parish church, and the Sabbath, the Lord's Day, kept with a strictness that was the wonder and sometimes the scandal of other lands. On the Sabbath the city went to the kirk, the work of the week set aside, The booths shut, the markets stilled, the life of the burgh turned to worship, and the people gathered in the high kirk of St. Giles and the other kirks of the city for the services, the sermons above all, for the sermon was the heart of the Reformed worship, the preaching of the word, the minister in the high pulpit, expounding the scriptures at great length to the gathered congregation, the people listening, hour upon hour, for the services were long and the sermons longer, the day given to worship and the hearing of the word. And the keeping of the Sabbath was enforced, by the kirk and the burgh together, the Sabbath breaking punished, the work and the play and the idleness of the holy day forbidden, the city held to the strict observance of the Lord's day. And the faith was not for the Sabbath only, but ran through each day, in the family worship of every godly household, the daily prayers and scripture and psalms that we have seen in our family's evening, in the catechizing of the children, in the discipline of the kirk that watched over the morals of the people, the kirk session that judged and corrected the sins of the parish, the apparatus of godly discipline that ordered the lives of the people. It was a serious faith, a stern faith, a faith of sin and judgment and the sovereignty of God. But it was also a deep and a sustaining faith, a faith that gave meaning and order and comfort to lives that were often hard, that held the people through the troubles and the dangers and the sorrows of their world, that gave them hope beyond the hard present, that bound them together in the great shared enterprise of the godly life. And in a year of war and rumoured plague, the faith was the great refuge, the trust in the providence of God that held the people through the dread of the times, the prayer for mercy and protection, the casting of their cares upon the God they trusted. For our family, the faith was the frame of their whole life, the kirk and the Sabbath, the daily worship, the godly upbringing of the children, the trust in providence through the troubled times. They were covenanters like their city, bound to the cause of the kirk, devout and serious and stern in their faith, and their religion was no mere observance but the very heart of their lives, the thing that gave meaning to their days, and comfort in their fears and hope beyond the hard present. And this winter, with the war raging and the plague rumoured, their faith was tested and exercised and leaned upon, the prayers more earnest, the trust more needed, the casting of their cares upon God more constant, the godly family holding to its faith through the dread of the times, trusting the providence of God for the safety of the household and the city and the cause, in the firelit room by the fire, on the winter's night, with the troubles of the age pressing close beyond the shuttered windows, and the faith of generations holding firm within. Let us lift our eyes for a while from the warm hall and the firelit family, and look out beyond the shuttered windows at the world beyond in which this evening sits. For the year 1644 was no quiet year in Scotland, and the city beyond the close and the kingdom beyond the city were caught up in great and troubling events, and the family by the fire, godly and careful as they were, knew it and felt it, and could not be wholly free of it, even in the warmth of their home. For these were the years of the religious and political convulsion that shook all three of the kingdoms, England and Scotland and Ireland together, the years of covenant and war, when the deepest questions of how men should worship God and how they should be governed had broken at last into open conflict, and Scotland was in the very heart of it. The Scots had risen some years before in defence of their kirk, their own Presbyterian church, against the attempts of the king to force upon them a form of worship they would not have, and they had bound themselves together in a great solemn covenant, the national covenant, swearing before God to defend their religion, and the city of Edinburgh had been at the centre of that great movement, for it was in the kirkyard of Greyfriars in this very city that the covenant had been signed, and the people of Edinburgh were covenanters to the core, devout and stubborn and fierce in defence of their faith. And the covenanting cause had grown into war, into the war that was even now tearing through all three kingdoms, the Scots in arms, their army gone south into England to fight alongside the English Parliament against the king, The whole land caught up in the struggle over religion and royal power that would run for years and cost the lives of multitudes. And this very winter, while the family sat by its fire, the war had come home to Scotland itself, for there had risen in the Highlands a bold soldier for the king, the Marquess of Montrose, who, with a small, fierce army of Highlanders and Irishmen, was even then carrying fire and sword through the country in a brilliant and terrible campaign against the Covenanting government, winning battle after battle against the odds, throwing the whole country into alarm, so that the news that reached Edinburgh that winter was news of war and defeat and dread, of Montrose loose in the land, of armies marching, of the Covenanting cause in peril. The city was a Covenanting city, the government a Covenanting government, and the news of Montrose's victory struck fear into the burgh, the fear of the royalist army drawing near, the fear for the cause and the kirk and the country, and the talk in the booths and the closes and about the fire was full of it, the war, the news, the dread of what might come. So the family by the fire lived in anxious times, in a kingdom at war with itself and with its neighbours, in a city at the heart of a great and perilous cause, and the trouble of the times was part of the air they breathed, the news of war and the fear for the future woven into the talk of every evening, the godly family praying for the cause and the kirk and the safety of the land in times of great peril, and yet they lived too their ordinary life, as people do even in the worst of times, the trade and the household and the children and the fire, the warm evening at home going on in the midst of the troubled times. For life does not stop for war and dread, but goes on. The supper cooked and eaten, the children tended, the psalms sung, the home kept safe and snug as far as it could be kept in the midst of the storms of the age. That was the state of this winter, a world of war and covenant and dread, of a kingdom in upheaval and a cause in peril, and into that troubled world there was creeping this winter the faintest first whisper of a different and an older terror, not of armies but of sickness, the rumour of plague, of which we must speak next, for it was beginning, just beginning, to be heard in the city, beneath the louder noise of the war. And now I must speak gently of the thing that lay at the very edge of this winter, the faint cold thread of unease that ran beneath the warmth of the evening, for it was there, and it was real, and it is part of the truth of this particular night, though the family by the fire would not have spoken much of it, and we will not dwell on it long. For this winter, in the city and the country round, there had begun to be heard here and there, in the quiet way that such things begin, the first faint talk of sickness, the old dreaded word that no one liked to say too loud, the rumour of the pestilence, the plague, that ancient terror that came and went down the centuries, and that every man and woman of that age feared above almost all else, for they had it in their memory and their family stories, the visitations of the past, the times when the sickness had come and emptied the closes and filled the kirkyards, and they knew, with the deep dread of long experience, what it could do. But it was this winter only a rumour, only the faintest beginning of unease, nothing certain, nothing near, nothing that broke the ordinary round of life. A word heard in the close, that there was sickness in some far burgh, in some town across the water, in some place a traveller had passed through, a ship spoken of at Leith that had been turned away, or held, for fear of what it might carry, a neighbour's anxious question, half joking, half not, about the news from the ports, a heaviness in the prayers at the kirk, a petition added for the staying of sickness, for the mercy of God upon the city, small matters, scattered hints, the kind of half-heard, half-believed talk that drifts through a city when something is feared but nothing is yet known, the unease that gathers quietly at the edge of things before anyone can say for certain whether there is cause. The family heard it as everyone heard it, and set it aside, as everyone set it aside, for there was no certain trouble, only the rumour, and a family cannot live in dread of a rumour, but must go on with its life. And so they went on, the trade and the home and the evening, with only the faintest shadow at the back of the mind, the small cold thought put away but not quite gone. There was, perhaps, an added earnestness in the good wife's care of her children that winter, an added quickness to keep them close and safe and well, an added fervour in the family's prayers for health and safety, an added attention in the merchant to the news from the ports. But these were small things, scarcely spoken, the ordinary precautions and anxieties of careful people in an uncertain time, not dread, not panic, only the heightened watchfulness of those who have heard a distant warning and hope it comes to nothing. For they did not know, the family by the fire, what we know, looking back, of what that winter's faint rumour would grow into, of the terrible visitation that was coming, that would, before another year was out, fall upon the city with a force not seen in living memory, and empty these very closes and fill these very kirkyards. They did not know it, and we will not tell it tonight, for tonight they are safe and warm and together, and the trouble is still only a far faint whisper, and there is no good in our carrying the future into their snug room, and spoiling the peace of their evening with the knowledge of what they could not see. So let us set it aside, as they set it aside, the cold thread of unease, and let it sink back to the edge of things where it belongs tonight, beneath the warmth and the light and the comfort of the present evening. It is there, and we have acknowledged it, the faint first whisper of the coming trouble, for it would not be honest to pretend this winter was wholly untroubled, to give you a warmth with no shadow at its edge when the shadow was real. But it is only at the edge, only a whisper, only a far cold thought put away, and the evening itself is warm and whole and safe, the family together by the fire, the present mercies real and present, and it is the warmth and not the shadow that is the truth of this particular night. Let the rumour fade then back into the dark beyond the shutters where it waits, and let us return to the firelight and the family and the snug safe present evening, which is after all what we came for, and which is tonight still untouched, still whole, still warm. Let us think, gently, of health and sickness and the body in this age, for it bears on the faint unease of this particular winter, and it tells us much about the world the family lived in, though we will keep it plain and not dwell on the grim. For people of this age lived far closer to sickness and death than we do, in a world without the medicine we know, where disease was common and often fatal, where the hold on life was uncertain at each age, where families bore many children in the knowledge that not all would grow, where the strong might be carried off in a few days by a fever, where the doctors could do little against the diseases, and death was a familiar and a constant presence in each household and every life. It was a world of frequent death, the age, death of the young and the old and the strong alike, death from the fevers and the agues and the fluxes and the consumptions and the thousand diseases that medicine could not cure, death a familiar visitor to each home, the people living always in its near presence, holding their loved ones in the knowledge of how easily they might be lost. And against the sickness the people had little, for the medicine of the age was a poor and a limited thing, a mixture of old learning and folk remedy and guesswork, the physicians with their theories of the humours and their bleedings and purgings that did as much harm as good, the apothecaries with their herbs and their compounds, the folk remedies handed down, the charms and the cures of the common people, the limited apparatus of a medicine that understood little of the true causes of disease and could do little against the killers. The good wife of a household was, in good part, its physician, with her store of remedies and her book of receipts, her herbs and her cordials and her cures, treating the common ailments of the family with the home remedies of the age, calling the physician or the apothecary only for the graver troubles, and even then with little hope of much help against the serious diseases. It was a world that bore its sickness with little remedy, that trusted, in the end, more to God and to providence than to medicine, that met disease and death with the resignation and the faith of people who knew how little they could do against them. And the greatest terror of all, the disease that stood above all others in the dread of the age, was the plague, the pestilence, the killer that came and went across the centuries, and that when it came could empty a city, the disease against which medicine was wholly helpless, and that struck with a swiftness and a deadliness that nothing could stay. The people knew the plague, in their memory and their family stories, the visitations of the past, the times when the sickness had come, and the closes had emptied, and the kirkyards had filled, and they feared it above all things, with the deep dread of long experience, knowing what it could do, knowing how little could be done against it. And so the faint rumour of plague that ran beneath this winter struck a particular deep chord of dread, for it touched the oldest and the greatest of the age's fears, the terror of the pestilence, the disease that medicine could not touch, and that, when it came as a judgment and a scourge, emptying the crowded city. But we will not dwell on it, the dread, for tonight the family is well and sound and healthy, the household sound, the children strong, no sickness in the warm house, only the faint, far rumour at the edge of things. And the family, like all the people of the age, lived with the near presence of sickness and death as the ordinary condition of their world, bore it with the resignation and the faith of their kind, trusted their health and their lives to the providence of God, and went on this winter with their ordinary life well and sound and safe, putting the far rumour aside, giving thanks for the present health of the household, the sound bodies and the strong children and the well household, the present mercy of health that they held this winter's night, whole and real, whatever the future might hold. Let us give thanks with them then, for the present health of the cosy house, the sound sleeping household, the strong drowsing children, the well family safe in the warm room, and let the dread of sickness sink back to the edge where it belongs tonight, beneath the present mercy of a healthy household, safe and whole and well, on the winter's night, in the shut house on the ridge. Let us turn, now, to the children of the house, for they were the life and the hope and the heart of the home, and a family's evening was shaped in good part around them, and their world is worth our seeing. The children of a merchant's family in this age lived a life that was, by our measure, both freer and harder than the life of children now, freer in that they were less watched and less coddled, and more left to make their own way among the crowded life of the close and the street, and harder in that childhood was a more dangerous passage, then the hold on life uncertain, the diseases of childhood often fatal, so that a family bore many children in the knowledge that not all would grow, and the love of a child was shadowed always by that knowledge. But the children of this house were, this winter, well and whole, and they filled the home with their life, the elder ones already half grown into their parts, the younger ones still small, the brood of them part of the warmth and the noise and the joy of the household. The elder children were already learning their places in the world. The boys, if the family ran to it, went to the school, the grammar school of the burgh, where they learned their Latin and their letters in the hard, disciplined way of the age, the hours and the strict master and the rod, the schooling that would fit them for the trade or the kirk or the law, the careers open to a merchant's son. And at home the boys began to learn the trade, going down with their father to the booth, learning the goods and the reckoning and the ways of the merchant's business, the elder son above all being groomed perhaps to follow his father in the trade and the burgess-ship. The girls learned at their mother's side the running of a household, the cooking and the spinning and the sewing and the marketing and the thousand skills of the good wife, the schooling that would fit them to keep a home of their own when they married, For marriage and the keeping of a household was the destiny of a merchant's daughter, and the years of girlhood were the preparing for it. And all the children learned their faith, the catechism and the psalms and the scriptures, the godly upbringing that was the first duty of a Christian parent in that devout age. The children taught to know God and fear him and walk in his ways from their earliest years. And the younger children, the little ones, lived the close sheltered life of small children in a loving home, in the care of their mother and the maid and the elder children, fed and tended and taught, playing their small games, learning their first words and steps and letters, the small warm centre of the family's love and care. The very youngest might still be in the cradle, or just out of it, the baby of the house, tended with the particular anxious love that a family in that age of uncertain infancy gave to its smallest and most fragile members. And the children slept, the little ones, in the box beds or the cradle or the truckle bed, tucked snug in the cold house, while the family's evening went on, the smallest already asleep as the evening passed, the elder ones sitting up a while in the firelight before they too were sent to bed. There is a tenderness in the picture of the children in the firelit room, the elder ones at their books or their play or listening to the talk, the little ones drowsing towards sleep, the brood gathered in the warmth, the parents' love and hope and care all centred on them. The more so this particular winter, with the faint talk of sickness in the air, for a parent who heard the distant rumour of plague held the children the closer, and watched them the more anxiously, and prayed for them the more fervently, the love of the child sharpened by the shadow of the times. But the children, of course, knew nothing of the shadow, and lived their warm, sheltered, untroubled life in the heart of the loving home, playing and learning and drowsing by the fire, safe in the warmth and the love, knowing nothing of war or sickness or the hard, uncertain world beyond the shuttered windows, only the cosy room and the firelight, and the love of their family about them, which is, after all, the whole world a child needs, and which they had, this winter's night, whole and cosy and safe. Let them drowse then, the children, by the fire, in the firelit room, safe in the love of their home, and let us watch them toward their sleep with the same tenderness their parents felt. The children of the house, warm and whole and safe, on the winter's night, 400 years ago. Let us think of the neighbours of the close as a community, for our family did not live alone but in the midst of a crowded vertical community, the tall land full of households stacked one above another, the close full of lands, the crowded close a small intense world of neighbours living packed together, and this closeness was one of the great facts of life in the old town. For in the tall lands of the old town all sorts lived stacked one above another in the single building, and our merchant's family on its good middle floor had above it and below it the other households of the land, the families of different stations and trades and means living close together up the one stair, sharing the one close neighbours in the intense close way of the crowded city. Below them, on the lower floors, might live poorer families, for the lower floors were less desirable, darker and damper, closer to the foul close below, and the poor took them, the labourers and the lesser craftsmen and the struggling, the families that could not afford the better floors above. And above them, in the high garrets under the roof, lived the poorest of all, for the climb was long and the garrets cold, and the poorest took the highest cheapest rooms, the widows and the labourers and the poor, climbing the stair to their cold rooms at the top. And on the good middle floors lived the prosperous and the genteel, the merchants and the lawyers and the comfortable, our family among them, the social range of the city stacked vertically in the one tall land, the poor below and above, the prosperous in the good middle, all climbing the one stair, all sharing the one close, all neighbours in the crowded land. And the neighbours knew one another, in the intimate way of the crowded city, the households of the land and the close living side by side, meeting on the stair, knowing one another's business and comings and goings, the close a small intense community, where everyone knew everyone, where the news and the gossip and the help and the quarrels of neighbours cheek by jowl filled the daily life. There was a closeness in it, a community, the neighbours of the land bound together by their shared life, helping one another in trouble, sharing the news and the talk. The close a kind of extended household, a community of neighbours living packed together up the tall lands and along the dark close. And there was friction in it too, the quarrels and the rivalries and the frictions of people living too crowded together, the disputes over the stair and the water and the noise and the thousand small matters of crowded life, the close a place of quarrels as well as community, the neighbours bound together and chafing against one another in the intense closeness of the crowded city. It was a particular way of living, the close community of the old town, the crowding and the closeness and the knowing of one another, so different from the separate private lives of a later age, the social range living stacked together in the one land, the neighbours known and knowing and bound together in the intense community of the close. And in a year of trouble, of war and rumoured sickness, the community took on a particular weight, for the neighbours shared the dread of the times as they shared everything, the talk of the war and the rumour of plague passing through the close, the anxious sharing of news and fear, and, should the worst come, should the sickness indeed fall upon the city, the neighbours would share that too, the terror passing through the crowded lands, the neighbours falling sick packed together in the packed close, the dreadful intimacy of the plague in the crowded city. But that was the future, and the close tonight was a community at peace, the neighbours sleeping in their stacked households up the tall land, the close gone still under the winter night, the merchant's family among its neighbours in the crowded land, part of the tight community of the old town, safe this night, and warm in the midst of the sleeping close. Come now to the daily traffic of the close and the stair of the comings and goings that filled the life of the tall land, for the close was not a still place but a busy one, a thoroughfare of constant movement, and the stair of the land was climbed and descended all the day long by all who lived and worked and called there, and the life of it is worth our seeing. For the close was the way to and from the high street for all who lived down it, and up and down it all the day went the traffic of the crowded community, the people of the lands coming and going to their work and their business, the merchants down to their booths and home again, the craftsmen to their workshops, the servants to the wells and the markets, the children to the school, the daily flow of a crowded community, passing up and down the one narrow steep close between the tall lands. And up and down the turnpike stair of the land went a like traffic all the day, for the stair was the common way for all the stacked households of the land, the families of the different floors climbing and descending to their different homes, and with them all who had business in the land, the visitors and the tradesmen and the carriers. There were the water caddies, climbing the stair all day with their barrels and stoops, carrying the water up to the households that paid them, the water carriers whose whole trade was the climbing of the tall stairs with the heavy water. There were the other caddies, the porters and the message carriers, the men who for a fee would carry a burden or run an errand or guide a stranger, the caddies who were a feature of the old town, knowing every close and every land and every household, carrying and fetching and guiding through the crowded city. There were the tradesmen delivering their goods, the merchants' purchases, the provisions, the fuel, all carried up the stair by hand. There were the visitors, the kin and the friends and the neighbours, climbing to the households of the land. The whole daily traffic of a crowded community passing up and down the one stair, all the day, from the dawn to the dark. And the close and the stair were the place where the life of the community met and mingled, for in the passing up and down the people met on the stair, in the close, the neighbours meeting and greeting and stopping to talk, the news and the gossip passing, the small daily encounters of a crowded community, the close and the stair, the meeting place where the life of the land and the close came together, the people knowing one another, meeting daily on the stair, the whole intimate, crowded social life of the community carried on in the comings and goings of the close. It was a sociable place, the close, for all its darkness and its steepness and its filth, the place where the community met and mingled, the daily traffic of the stair, the daily life of the neighbours meeting, the close a thoroughfare and a meeting place, and the very vein of the community's life. And then, as the short day failed and the dark came down, the traffic of the close ebbed, the people home from their work and their business, the comings and goings slowing and stopping, the close growing quiet and dark and empty as the households shut themselves in for the night. The caddies ceased their climbing, the tradesmen their delivering, the neighbours their coming and going, the daily traffic of the close ebbing away into the shutlands as the people drew into their fires for the evening, the busy daytime close falling still and dark under the winter night, the stair no longer climbed, the close no longer trafficked, the crowded community drawn in from the close into the warm shut homes for the evening and the longer night. And our family was drawn in with the rest. The merchant home from his booth up the darkening close, the household gathered in for the evening, the close outside grown still and dark and empty, the daily traffic ended, the warm shut house holding the family safe, while the close lay dark and still without, the busy thoroughfare of the day gone quiet under the night, waiting, like the household and the city, for the morning that would set the traffic of the close flowing again up and down the stair, the daily life of the crowded community taking up again with the new day. Let us stop now and simply listen and breathe, for the city of this age was a thing of particular sounds and particular smells, utterly unlike the city of our own time, and to truly be there, we must let it reach us through the ear and the nose as well as the eye. Begin with the sounds, for the city was full of sound, but sound of a kind we never hear. The sounds of a world without engines, without machines, where every sound was made by a living thing or a natural force, the human and animal and elemental sounds of a pre-mechanical world. There were the voices of the crowded city, the cries of the markets and the street sellers, the talk and the calling of the people in the closes and the street, the children playing, the whole human noise of the crowded ridge, far louder and closer and more constant than we might think, the thousands of voices of the packed city. There were the bells of the kirks and the toll booth marking the hours and calling to worship and tolling for the dead, the slow grave music of the bells carrying over the ridge. There was the cry of the town guard, the watch calling through the night. There were the animals, the horses and the dogs and the fowls and the beasts driven through the streets to market, the animal sounds woven through the life of the city. And there was the wind, always the wind in this high-exposed place, moving in the closes and round the tall lands, the voice of the northern weather. And the smells, for the city was a thing of powerful smells, far stronger and more various than the city of our own sanitized age, the smells of a crowded pre-modern town. There was the smoke above all, the brown reek of the 1,000 peat and coal fires that gave the city its by-name of Old Reeky, the old smoky one, the smoke hanging low over the ridge in a brown pall, the smell of the burning peat sweet and brown, the coal heavier and harsher, the mingled smoke, the very breath of the city in winter. There was the smell of the cooking, the food cooking in 1,000 homes, drifting through the closes. There were the smells of the trades, the tanning and the brewing and the baking and the slaughtering, the working smells of the crowded city. And there were the smells of the crowding itself, the middens and the waste, the foul closes where the slops came down, the unsanitary smells of a crowded city without modern sanitation, the powerful earthy unlovely smells of the packed ridge that we would find hard to bear and that the people of the age scarcely noticed, so much were they the ordinary air of their world. It was a city of strong sensations, then, loud and smoky and smelly and intense, the crowded ridge assaulting the senses in a way our cleaner, quieter cities do not. The sounds and the smells of the packed pre-modern town, the voices and the bells and the wind, the smoke and the cooking and the middens, the whole powerful sensory presence of the crowded city. And within it, the firelit house was a refuge for the senses too, the shut room with its own smells of the fire and the cooking and the family, its own sounds of the household at its evening, a small warm sensory shelter within the larger sensory tumult of the city, the shut house holding out the worst of the smells and the noise, as it held out the cold, the firelit room, a refuge of the senses as of the body. And at night, as the city slept, the sounds and the smells changed and quieted, the daytime tumult of voices and markets and trades giving way to the stillness of the night, the cry of the watch, the toll of the bell, the wind in the closes, the few small sounds of the sleeping city, the cooking smells and the working smells fading, the smoke of the banked fires thinning, the night smells of the cold and the frost and the wind off the firth. The sleeping city had its own quieter sensations, the night sounds and the night smells of the ridge at rest, and within the close-shut house the family slept, wrapped in the small warm sensory shelter of the home, the fire smell and the close still air, and the quiet of the sleeping household, the warm refuge of the senses within the cold quiet night of the sleeping city. Let us breathe it then, the night air of the old town, the cold and the frost and the thinning smoke, and listen to it, the wind and the watch and the bell, and feel ourselves there, in the sleeping city, in the snug shut house, on the winter's night, 400 years ago, when the city was a thing of sounds and smells we will never hear or breathe again. Let us think of how the people knew the time, of the marking of the hours in the old city, for the passing of time was told in ways we have half forgotten, and the sounds that marked it were part of the very texture of life in the burgh. For the people of this age had no clocks in their pockets, few clocks even in their houses, and the telling of the time was a public thing, marked for the whole city by the great public clocks and above all by the bells that rang out over the ridge and ordered the hours of the city's life. The great bell of the High Kirk of St. Giles, the bell of the toll booth, these were the voices that told the city its time, ringing out the hours over the crowded ridge, calling the people to their worship and their work and their rest, the public bells that ordered the common life of the burgh. The bells rang through the day, marking the hours, and they rang for the great occasions, for the worship and the gatherings and the alarms, and they rang too at the close of the day and the start of it, the curfew bell of an evening that told the city the day was ending, the time to bank the fires and bar the doors and draw in for the night, and the morning bell that called the city back to life at the start of the working day. The bells were the clock of the city, the public voice that told the time to all, and the people lived by them, ordering their days by the ringing of the bells, the worship and the work and the rest, all called and marked by the bells that rang out over the ridge. And in the night, through the dark hours, the bells rang on, marking the passing hours of the night for the wakeful and the watchful, the slow toll carrying over the sleeping city, telling the hours of the dark to any who lay awake to hear them. There were other markers of the time too, the cries of the watch through the night, the town guard calling the hours as they walked their rounds, the human voice telling the time through the dark to the sleeping city, the changing of the light, the slow coming of the late winter dawn, and the early fall of the winter dark, the people reading the time in the light as country folk had always read it, the rhythms of the day's life, the opening of the booths and the markets, the gathering and the dispersing of the crowds, the daily round of the city's life, that marked the passing of the hours as surely as any bell. The people lived in time told by these public markers, the bells and the cries and the light and the rhythms of the day, a slower and a more public and a more shared sense of time than our own private exact time, the whole city moving together through the hours marked by the common bells. And there was a comfort in it, the shared public time, the bells that rang for all, the whole city moving together through the marked hours, the common rhythm of the days and the nights told by the common bells. The family lived by it, their days ordered by the bells, the worship and the work and the rest, called and marked by the public voices of the city, the shared time of the burgh, ordering the life of the household as it ordered the life of all. And the bells marked the greater turns of time as well as the hours, the turning of the year above all. For though the godly city had stripped away so many of the old festivals, the turn of the year in the deep of the winter dark was still marked, and the bells rang it in, the old midwinter turning that no kirk could quite suppress, the ringing of the bells at the turn of the year, the marking of the year's death and the year's birth in the deep of the winter night. The people kept it, the turn of the year, the gathering and the marking of the year's turn, the bells ringing out over the ridge in the cold midnight, the old midwinter festival of the turning year, the one great festival the reformed city still kept, the bells ringing in the new year over the sleeping or the waking city in the deep of the winter dark, the great turn of the year marked, like the hours, by the common bells of the burgh, ringing out over the crowded ridge, telling the city that the old year was gone and the new year come, in the deep cold dark of the northern midwinter. And tonight, as the family sleeps, the bells ring on through the dark, marking the slow passing hours of the winter night, the toll of St. Giles carrying over the sleeping ridge, telling the hours of the dark to the watchful and the wakeful, the slow grave music of the bells passing over the shut sleeping houses where the people lie at rest. The hours pass, marked by the bells, the long night turning slowly toward the late winter dawn, the city sleeping through the marked hours, the family safe and at rest in the shut house on the ridge, the bells telling the slow passing of the night over the sleeping city, on toward the morning that the morning bell would bring, when the city would wake again to its ordered day, called back to life by the bells that had watched over its sleep. Let us think of the dangers of the old town, of the perils that lay about the crowded city, for the warm safe house was a refuge against real dangers, and the safety of the home was the sweeter for the perils it shut out. The first and the greatest of the dangers was fire, the terror of each household in the crowded city, for the old town was a city of tall houses built close together, many of them with timber fronts and timber within, packed shoulder to shoulder up the lands and along the closes, and in such a city a fire was a deadly peril, for a blaze in one land might leap to the next and run through a whole close before it could be checked, and a bad fire might destroy whole streets and lands and lives. And the people lived with the constant fear of it, the more so because the life of the house depended on fire, the fires that warmed and cooked and lit the homes, the open flames in every dwelling, the candles and the hearths, the constant danger of the flame getting loose, so that the tending and the banking and the watching of the fire was a constant careful labour, the good warmth always shadowed by the lurking terror of the blaze. The burgh fought the danger as it could, with its rules against the timber fronts and the thatch, its requirements for the building in stone, its provisions for the fighting of fire, the buckets and the ladders and the rough fire-fighting of the age. But a bad fire, once loose in the crowded city, was hard to stop, and the fear of it was real and constant, the householders careful of their fires, the burgh watchful, the crowded city living with the lurking danger of the flame, and the family in their snug house lived with it too, careful of their fire, banking it safe at night, watchful against the blaze, the good warmth of the hearth, always shadowed by the knowledge of the danger, the careful tending of the fire that was the household's comfort and its peril both. There were other dangers in the crowded city, the dangers of crime and violence in the dark, for the old town at night was a dark place, the closes black and steep, the streets unlit but for the lanterns of the watch and the passers-by, and in the dark there was danger, the thieves and the robbers, the violence of a rough age, the perils of the dark streets and closes after nightfall. And against these the burgh had its watch, the town guard, the watchmen who kept the streets through the dark hours, walking their rounds with their lanterns, calling the time, keeping order, guarding against the thief and the troublemaker, the rough policing of the age, the watch that kept the city through the night. And a careful household locked itself in against the dangers of the dark, the door barred, the shutters fast, the home secured against the perils of the night, the warm shut house a refuge against the dark, dangerous streets without. And there was this winter, the new and the greater dread, the rumoured sickness, the plague that was the deadliest danger of all, against which neither the watch nor the locked door nor any care could surely guard, the pestilence that, should it come, would be the worst peril the crowded city could face, spreading through the packed lands and the dark closes, the dreadful danger that lay this winter at the edge of things. But that was the future and the rumour, and the present dangers were the old familiar ones, the fire and the crime and the perils of the dark, against which the family guarded as all households guarded, the careful tending of the fire, the locked door, the barred shutters, the close-shut house secured against the dangers of the crowded city. And tonight the house was safe, the fire banked careful and safe, the door barred, the shutters fast, the family secure in the close-shut house against the perils without, the fire and the dark and the danger held at bay by the care of the household, the cosy, safe home a refuge against the real dangers of the old town, the family sleeping secure this winter's night, in the carefully guarded house on the ridge, safe against the perils of the dark crowded city without. Let us draw back for a while from the close and the house, and look at the whole of the city in its setting. For Edinburgh was a city of a dramatic and a remarkable situation, set among crags and hills above the sea, and the whole of it was strung along the one great ridge between two mighty bookends, and the situation shaped the city and gave it its character. For the ridge on which the old town stood ran down from a height at one end to a hollow at the other, and at the head of the ridge, on its highest point, on a sheer crag of rock that fell away on three sides, stood the castle, the fortress that crowned the city, the ancient stronghold on its rock, black and mighty above the town, the castle that guarded the ridge and dominated the city and the country round, the fortress at the head of the high street, looking out over the town that ran down the ridge below it. And at the foot of the ridge, in the hollow where the high street ran down at last to level ground, stood the other great bookend of the city, the Abbey and Palace of Holyrood, the royal palace at the foot of the town, the Abbey church beside it, the royal seat at the bottom of the ridge as the castle was the fortress at the top. Between the two, between the castle on its crag and the palace in its hollow, ran the high street, the spine of the city, down the back of the ridge, the town strung along the one street between the fortress and the palace, the castle above and the palace below, and the crowded city between the tall lands climbing the ridge between the two great poles of the city's life, the military and the royal, the fortress and the court. And the ridge itself was hemmed and bounded, for the city was penned into its narrow space by the lie of the land and the works of men. To the north fell away the ground to the Loch, the dark stagnant loch that filled the valley below the ridge on that side, hemming the city in, a foul sheet of water that was the city's northern boundary and its drain and its defence. To the south ran the town wall, the great wall thrown about the city, the Flodden wall built in the fear of the old wars, and added to since. the wall that girdled the crowded town and bounded its growth on the south. And so the city was penned between the loch and the wall on the narrow ridge, with the castle at the head and the palace at the foot, the town crowded into the small bounded space, climbing toward the sky because it could not spread, that our lands rising on the hemmed ridge between the crag and the hollow, the loch and the wall. It was a dramatic situation then, the city among its crags and hills, the fortress on its rock, the royal palace in its hollow, the crowded ridge between, the loch below and the hills beyond, the sea firth glinting to the north, the city set among a landscape of crag and hill and water of a wild northern grandeur. And the family in their warm house lived in the midst of this dramatic setting, on the ridge between the castle and the palace, hemmed by the loch and the wall, the fortress above them, and the royal seat below, the wild northern landscape of crag and hill and sea about the crowded city, though on a dark winter's night, shut cosy in the house with the shutters barred, the grandeur of the setting was unseen, and it felt perhaps in the wind off the firth and the cold off the hills, the dramatic city sleeping in its dramatic setting under the winter dark, the castle black on its crag above, the palace dark in its hollow below, the crowded ridge between gone still under the night, the whole remarkable city at its rest among the crags and hills above the cold northern sea. Today, we have come to the city in the deep of winter, but let us think of the turning year, of the rhythm of the seasons as the city knew them, for the year had its great cycle, and the winter we are in was one turn of it, and the life of the city moved with the seasons in ways we have half forgotten. The winter which holds us now was the hard time, the dark cold time, the days short and the nights long, the cold gripping the ridge, the people drawn in close to their fires, the life of the city turned inward, the trade slowed by the dangerous winter seas, the city hunkered down against the cold and the dark, waiting out the hard months. It was a time of indoor life, of the warm shut house and the fire, of the evenings and the nights, the people living close about their hearths through the dark, cold winter, as our family lives tonight, drawn in against the weather. And then the year turned, as it always turned, and the spring came, late and welcome in the cold north, the days lengthening, the light returning, the cold easing, the city stirring back to life after the winter, the trade quickening with the safer seas, the people coming out from their fires into the lengthening days. The spring was the time of return and renewal, the hard winter past, the light and the warmth returning, the city waking to the New Year's life. And then the summer, the brief precious northern summer, the long light days, the short bright nights, the warmth, the city at its busiest and brightest, the trade in full flow, the markets full, the people out in the long light evenings, the brief glad summer of the north. And then the autumn, the harvest, the gathering in, the days shortening again, the first cold returning, the city preparing for the winter to come, laying in the stores, the salting and the storing against the hard months ahead. And then the winter again, the wheel come full circle, the cold and the dark returning, the people drawing in again to their fires, the year's great cycle turning on. And the life of the household moved with the year, the laying in of stores in the autumn against the winter, the salt beef and the salt fish, the meal and the malt, the provisions stored against the hard months when little came in, the drawing into the fire in the winter, the indoor life of the cold dark months, the coming out in the spring and the summer, the busier brighter life of the warm season, the rhythm of the household's year moving with the turning seasons, the storing and the spending, the drawing in and the coming out, the cycle of the year shaping the life of the home as it shaped the life of the city. And the year had its marked days, its festivals and its seasons, though here the godly city had set its mark, for the reformed kirk had swept away many of the old festivals of the church year. The saints' days and the holy days of the old religion, as superstitious and popish, and even the great feast of Yule, the old Christmas, the kirk frowned upon and sought to suppress, the godly Scots keeping no Christmas as the old church had kept it. The day passed without the old feasting and revelry, the kirk stern against the old festivals. The turn of the year, the new year, the people kept, the old midwinter festival that no kirk could quite suppress, the marking of the year's turn in the deep of the winter dark. But the godly city had stripped much of the old festival year away, the saints' days and the holy days and the old Yule gone, the years round plainer and barer and more sober than in the old days or in less reformed lands, the godly Scots keeping their plain, sober, reformed year, the Sabbaths their chief holy days, the old festivals suppressed. And so the winter passed, in our godly family's house, without the old Yule feasting, plainly and soberly, the deep of the dark year kept without the old revelry, the family drawn into its fire through the hard cold months, keeping its plain godly winter, waiting, like the city and the country and the year itself, for the turn toward the spring and the light, the wheel of the year turning slowly through the northern dark, toward the distant return of the sun. Let us stop now, in the midst of the evening, and simply be in the firelit room, soaking in the whole of it, the deep sensory comfort of the firelit home on the winter's night, for the warmth of the room was a thing felt through all the senses, and to truly be there we must let it reach us as it reached the family, in all its warmth and light and smell and sound. Begin with the warmth, for the warmth was the first and the deepest of it, the good heat of the fire reaching out across the room, the warmth that was the point and comfort of the home on the cold night, the heat on the face and the hands of those who drew close to the hearth, the warmth that meant comfort and safety and home against the bitter cold beyond the shutters. It was a particular warmth, the warmth of the open fire, fierce close to and fading with distance, so that the family drew in close to the hearth, into the heart of the warmth, the faces lit and warmed by the flames, the backs to the cold room behind, the small bright circle of the firelight against the cold of the surrounding dark. Then the light, the dim ruddy light of the fire and the candles, the only light the age could give, so different from our own bright steady light, the firelight leaping and glowing, the candle flames small and warm, the whole room lit in the soft, dim, ruddy glow of flame, the corners sunk in shadow, the faces lit close and warm about the hearth. It was a dimmer world than ours, the firelit room, and a smaller, the light reaching only so far, the room drawn close about the small circle of warmth and light. But there was a deep intimacy in it, the dim glow, the close gathered circle, the soft uncertain light of the flame that drew the family together into the small lit heart of the home against the cold dark of the night. And the smell of the warm room, the sweet brown smell of the peat fire above all, the heavier smell of the coal, the smell of the cooking, and the supper, the smell of the tallow candles, the close human smell of the family gathered in the shut room, the whole mingled smell of the home on the winter's night, the smell that meant warmth and food and family and safety, the comfortable close smell of the shut firelit house, and the sounds, the small sounds of the close room, the crackle and settle of the fire, the soft sounds of the family at its evening, the talk and the work, the turning of the spinning wheel, the going of the needle, the reading of the book, the singing of the psalm, the children's quiet play, the small comfortable sounds of the household at its rest, and beneath them the sounds of the night beyond, the wind in the close, the cry of the watch, the toll of the bell, the cold night pressing against the shut firelit room. This was the cosy room on the winter's night, not as a set of furnishings and functions, but as an experience, a thing felt through all the senses at once, the warmth and the light and the smell and the sound of it all together, that deep total sensory comfort of the firelit home against the cold dark night, the warmth on the skin, the dim glow in the eye, the close fire smell, the small comfortable sounds, the enveloping sensory shelter of the cosy home. And it is this, more than any fact about it, that we must feel if we are truly to be there tonight, in the warm room, with the family, the deep sensory comfort of the firelit home, the warmth and the light and the smell and the sound of it wrapping us round, the small lit shelter against the cold dark, the deep old comfort of the home on the winter's night that we can still feel down all the centuries, as we sit with them by the fire and let the warmth of the room enfold us, the close-shut house on the cold dark ridge, the family safe and close in the firelight, the quiet Scottish winter's night. There is a labour that lay behind the comfort of the house that we have touched on, but that deserves its own telling, for it shaped the daily life of every household in the old town, and it is a thing we can hardly imagine, and that is the getting of water. For in the tall lands of the old town there was no water, none, no pipe, no tap, no well within the house, and each drop of water used in the home, for the cooking and the drinking, and the cleaning and the washing, had to be fetched from outside and carried up by hand the climb of the turnpike stair, and this was one of the great constant labours of the household, and one of the hardest. The water came from the public wells, the wells set in the high street and the closes, fed in time by the springs and the water brought into the town through pipes to the public cisterns, the wells where the people of the crowded city came for their water, the focus of much of the daily life of the street, the gathering place where the servants and the water caddies came with their stoops and pails, and from the well the water had to be carried home, and up the dark turnpike stair to the dwelling on its high floor, and this was heavy work, the carrying of the water up the steep stair, a labour done many times a day, for a household used much water, and it all had to be carried up, drop by drop, pail by pail, from the well in the street to the rooms at the top of the tall land. There were men who made their living at it, the water caddies, who for a fee would carry the water up the stairs for the households that would pay, climbing the tall lands all day with their barrels and pails, the water carriers of the old town, a whole trade built on the simple hard fact that the water was below and the people were above, and it all had to be carried up by hand, and where the household could not pay the caddy, or to save the fee, the servants carried it themselves, the maids climbing the stair with the heavy stoops, the daily labour of the water, up the steep dark turnpike from the well in the street to the firelit rooms above. And the dirty water, when it was done with, the waste and the slops, had to go down again, and in the way of the old town it went down quickly and simply, flung from the window into the close below, with the old cry of warning, the gardyloo, the watch-out, the cry that warned the passer-by below to stand clear before the slops came down, the foul water running down the steep closes toward the loch, the rough and ready and unlovely sanitation of the crowded ridge. It was a hard system, the water of the old town, the carrying up and the flinging down, the heavy labour of the supply and the rough disposal of the waste, and it tells us much about the life of the city, the crowding and the closeness and the hardness of it, the want of the conveniences we take for granted, the labour that lay behind every drop of water in the cosy house at the top of the stair. And it tells us too, this matter of the water and the waste, something of the conditions that made the city so terribly vulnerable when the sickness came, the crowding and the foul closes and the rough sanitation, the conditions in which the pestilence, when it came, could spread so swiftly through the packed lands and the dark closes of the ridge. But that is the future, and we will not dwell on it, only note, in passing, the hardness of the daily life behind the deep comfort of the home, the water carried up the stair, the labour and the closeness, and the want of conveniences, the hard real conditions of life in the crowded city, beneath and behind the warmth of the firelit room where the family slept, this winter's night, all unaware. As the family sleeps, let us think of the morning that will come, of the daily round that will begin again when the cold dawn breaks, for the evening we have shared was one turn of a daily cycle, and the morning would bring the household back to its labour and its life, and there is a comfort in the rhythm of it, the daily round turning on. The morning would come late and cold in the deep of the winter, the dawn slow and grey over the ridge, the light long in coming, and the household would wake in the cold dark before the dawn. The servants first, as always, rising from their beds in the cold to begin the day's labour. The first task, as each morning, would be the fire, the raking out of the banked embers, and the building up of the new fire from the night's smouldering peats, the coaxing of the flame back to life, so that the house should be warmed, and the fire ready for the day's cooking and the day's life. The first labour of the morning, the rekindling of the heart of the home. Rekrug's ding were reg. And from that first fire the household would come back to life, the servants about the morning labour, the fetching of the water up the stair, the starting of the cooking, the cleaning and the setting of the house for the day, the family rising, the parents and the children, to the cold morning, dressing in the cold, gathering for the morning worship and the morning meal, the porridge that began the Scottish day. The household gathered again about the fire for the start of the day, as it had gathered for the close of the evening. And then the day's round would begin, the merchant down to his booth on the high street, to the day's trade, climbing down the dark close to the street, to the booth, to the buying and selling and the business of the day, the good wife to her household, the ordering of the day's work, the marketing and the cooking and the managing of the home, the children to their lessons and their tasks, the school and the learning and the helping, the servants to their endless labour, the household back to its daily round, the trade and the home and the labour, the daily life of the family taking up again with the new day. It was a rhythm, the daily round, the waking and the fire and the worship and the meal, the day's labour and the evening's rest, the trade and the home, the rising and the working and the gathering again at evening about the fire, the daily cycle of the household's life turning on, day after day, through the winter and the year. And there was a comfort in the rhythm, the steady turning of the daily round, the reliable cycle of the days, the waking and the labouring and the resting, the home gathered each evening about the fire after the day's work, the steady, comforting rhythm of an ordinary life, in an ordinary household, the days turning on in their reliable round. The family lived in that rhythm, the daily cycle of their life, and there was security in it, the steady turning of the ordinary days, the reliable round of work and rest and home, the comfort of the ordinary life going on in its steady rhythm. And the morning would come, this winter, as every morning came, and the household would wake to it and take up the daily round again, the fire and the worship and the meal, the trade and the home and the labour, the ordinary life going on. They could not know, the family, what we know of how that ordinary rhythm would be broken in the year to come, how the daily round of the city would be shattered by the coming sickness, the booths shut, the trade stopped, the closes emptied, the ordinary life of the city torn apart by the terror. They could not know it, and tonight the rhythm was whole, the ordinary round turning on, the morning that would come a morning like any other, the daily life secure in its steady cycle. And we will not carry the knowledge of the broken future into the secure present of this winter's night, but leave the family to its ordinary rhythm, the daily round turning on, the morning that would come a morning like any other, the household waking to take up its ordinary life again, the trade and the home and the labour, the steady comforting cycle of the ordinary days, whole and secure, this winter, in the close house on the ridge, the family sleeping now toward a morning like any other, the ordinary round of their life turning on, secure and whole, this winter's night. There is one more quiet thing I want to bring you to before we let the night close over us entirely, and it is the human heart of the home, the love and the hope and the care that bound the family together, beneath all the facts of trade and burgh and faith and house. For in the end the home was not its furnishings or its standing, but the people in it and the love between them, and that is the truest part about this winter's night. For beneath all the order and the labour and the faith, this was a family, a husband and a wife and their children, and the servants who shared their life, bound together by the deep ordinary ties of a household, the love of husband and wife, the love of parents and children, the care and the loyalty, and the shared life of people who lived side by side in the shut house, and depended on one another, and held one another dear. Think of the husband and wife, the merchant and his good wife, bound together in the partnership of marriage, the shared labour of trade and household, the shared raising of the children, the shared life of the home, the deep ordinary love and loyalty and companionship of a married pair who had built a life together, who depended on one another, the husband at his trade and the wife at her household, the two halves of the one home, bound together in the shared enterprise of the family. Think of the parents and the children, the deep love of the parents for their children, the hope and the care and the anxious tenderness, the more anxious this winter for the shadow of the times, the children, the heart of the parents' love and hope, the future of the family, the dearest treasures of the home. Think of the household, the family, and the servants, bound together in the intimate life of the home, the shared meals and prayers and evenings, the shared labour and shared life, the household a community of its own, bound by the ties of dependence and loyalty, and the daily shared life of the warm house. And the love was shadowed this winter by the dread of the times, for to love is to fear for what one loves, and a family that heard the far rumour of plague held its loved ones the dearer for the shadow, loved the children the more anxiously, cherished the present safety of the household the more for the uncertain future, the love sharpened and deepened by the dread, as love is always sharpened by the knowledge of how easily the beloved may be lost. But the love was real, and present, and cosy, the deep ordinary love of the family, the husband and wife, the parents and children, the household bound together in the snug home, and it was the truest and the deepest part about the winter's night, the love that filled the bright room, the family gathered in the firelight, bound together by the deep ordinary ties of the home, safe and warm, and together this night, whatever the future held. For that, in the end, is what the home was and what it is, the place of love and safety and belonging, the cosy shelter of the family against the cold, hard world, and it is the deepest part that joins us to the family by the fire down all the centuries, the love of the home, the gathered family, the shelter against the cold, the deep, ordinary human love that filled their snug room as it fills our homes, the same love then as now, the same gathered family, the same snug shelter, the same deep human heart of the home. The facts of their world are strange to us, the trade and the burgh and the close and the box beds, but the heart of it is familiar, the love of the family, the gathered home, the safety and the belonging, and it is that, the human heart of the home, that we carry away from this winter's night, the family safe and warm and together in the firelit room, bound by love, gathered against the cold, that deep ordinary love of the home holding them close on the winter's night, 400 years ago, as love holds us close tonight, wherever we are, in our own snug homes against our own cold nights. And it is with that, the warmth and the love of the home, that we will leave them now, the family sleeping safe and at peace, and together, held by love in the cosy house on the ridge, as we turn at last toward our own sleep. The evening draws on now toward its close, and the household begins to think of sleep, and let us see how they went to their beds, for the sleeping arrangements of a house in this age were a particular matter, and the going to bed had its own rituals and comforts. The beds of the old townhouse were, many of them, box beds, the enclosed wooden beds that were the great comfort of the cold northern home, a bed built into a wooden frame closed in on the sides and the back and the top, with doors or a curtain across the front, so that the bed was a small enclosed wooden room of its own, a cosy close shelter within the cold room, in which the sleeper could shut himself away from the draughts and the cold and the dark, warm in the enclosed space under the blankets. The box bed was clever and comforting, for in a house where the cold flowed freely and the one fire reached only so far, the enclosed bed trapped the warmth of the body and shut out the draughts, and made, within its wooden walls, a small, warm, private place to sleep. And to climb into a box bed on a cold night, and pull the doors or the curtain to, and lie snug in the enclosed dark, was one of the deep, simple comforts of the age. And the beds were shared for the most part, for room was scarce and beds were few, and the cold made company welcome, so that the children slept together, 2 or 3 in a bed, the warmth of the shared bed a comfort against the cold, and the servants slept where they could, in the kitchen or on a truckle bed pulled out at night, the household bedded down cheek by jowl in the few rooms of the dwelling, the master and mistress in their box bed in the chamber, the children in theirs, the servants in their corners, the family sleeping snug in the snug shut house against the cold dark night. There was little privacy in it, by our measure the household sleeping close together in the few rooms, but there was warmth and there was company, and there was the deep safety of the gathered household sleeping close in the warm shut house, and they thought nothing of the closeness, for it was the way of their world, the family sleeping together in the few snug rooms at the top of the tall stone stair. The going to bed had its rituals, the small last labours and observances of the day's end. The fire was banked, the peats and the coals raked together and covered, to keep them smouldering low through the night, to be coaxed back to flame in the cold morning, for the fire was never let to die entirely through the winter. The shutters were checked, barred fast against the cold and the dark. The house was made secure, the door barred, for though they were high up the tall land, a careful household locked itself in for the night. The candles were put out, all but perhaps one to light the last to bed, for candles were precious and not to be wasted. And the family said its last prayers, the evening worship if it had not been said before, or the private prayers of each at the bedside, the commending of the household to God for the night, but more earnest this winter, perhaps for the troubles of the times, the prayer for safety and health, and the mercy of God through the dark hours. And then they climbed into their beds, into the box beds and the truckle beds, and the cradle the household to its rest, the warmth of the enclosed beds and the shared blankets against the cold, the doors and the curtains drawn, the candle out, the house dark and shut and snug, the family sleeping snug in the few rooms at the top of the stair, while the winter night pressed cold and black against the barred shutters. The fire glowed low and red in the banked hearth. The wind moved in the close outside. The city slept about them, the tall lands dark and shut, the closes empty, the crowded ridge gone quiet under the winter dark. And the family slept, safe and cosy and close, in the box beds in the close-shut house, the children drowsing into sleep, the parents settling to their rest, the servants bedded in their corners, the household carried down together into the deep, warm dark of sleep, safe this night, and whole, and together in the tall stone house on the ridge 400 years ago, on the winter's night. The household sleeps now, and the house is dark and still, and let us stand a moment in the quiet and listen to the city settling about us, for the old town at night had its own life and its own sounds, even in the deep of the dark, and they are worth our hearing before we let the night close over us entirely. The tall lands stand dark and shut along the ridge, the closes empty and black, the crowded city gone still under the winter night, the thousands of its people sleeping close in their tall stone houses, stacked floor on floor up the dark lands, the merchant and the caddy and the widow and the labourer all sleeping in the one tall house, the vertical crowded city at its rest. And over it all hangs the cold and the dark and the silence of the deep northern night, the wind moving off the firth and through the closes, the frost hard on the causeway, the castle black on its crag above, the loch dark in the hollow below, the whole old grey city sleeping on its ridge between the hills and the sea. But the city is not wholly silent even now, for a city never wholly sleeps, and through the dark there are sounds, the sounds of the old town at night. There is the cry of the town guard, the watch that kept the streets through the dark hours, calling the time or the all's well, their feet on the causeway, their lantern moving through the dark. There is the bell of St. Giles or the toll booth, marking the hours through the night, the slow toll carrying over the sleeping ridge. There is the wind, always the wind, moving in the closes and round the tall lands, sighing in the chimneys, the voice of the northern winter night. There is, now and again, a sound from the sleeping houses, a child's cry, a voice, a cough, the small sounds of the crowded life going on behind the shut doors and barred shutters, and beneath it all the deep silence of the dark, the city sleeping, the night passing, the slow hours of the winter dark turning toward the far-off dawn. It is long ago now, this winter's evening we have shared, near 400 years, and everything in it is gone, the city and the close and the tall house, the merchant and his good wife and their children, the servants, the fire and the firelight and the close-shut room, all of it gone down into the dark and the silence a very long time ago, and the city itself changed past knowing, the old town built over and built up and made new, the very ridge transformed. And we know, looking back, what they did not know, what came after that winter, the terrible visitation that fell upon the city the following year, the Great Plague of 1645, that emptied these very closes and filled these very kirkyards and carried off so many of the people of the crowded ridge. We know it, and they did not, and there is a sadness in the knowing, the safe family by the fire all unaware of what the next year held, the children drowsing safe in the firelight on the eve of the terror. But we will not carry that sadness into their warm room tonight, for tonight they are safe and whole and together, and the trouble is still only a far faint whisper, and it would be no kindness and no truth to let the future darken the bright present evening that was when they lived it, simply a good ordinary night at home. For that, in the end, is what we came for, and what they had, this winter's night, whole and warm and real, an ordinary evening at home, the fire and the supper and the family, the worship and the work and the talk, the children drowsing and the household settling, and the house gathered snug and safe against the cold dark night. That was the truth of this night, the warmth and not the shadow, the present mercy and not the coming trouble, the good ordinary evening that they lived and we have shared, and it is the warmth we should carry away from it, the close-shut house on the dark ridge, the family safe by the fire, the quiet Scottish night, the deep old comfort of home against the cold, and it joins us to them down all the centuries, that warmth, that comfort, the same need for shelter and warmth and the safety of home at the close of the day that they felt and we feel, the snug room against the cold night, the gathered household, the rest at the end of the day, the same deep human comfort, then as now, 400 years apart and yet the same. If these quiet journeys back into other times are something you would like to find your way to again, you would be most welcome to come along on the next of them, and it will find you gently when it comes. But that is a thought for the morning, and the morning is a long way off, and there is no hurry now to anything at all. The fire is banked low, the shutters are barred, the house is dark and warm and still, and the family sleeps, and the city sleeps about them, and you, wherever you are safe and warm and need do nothing now but rest. Let the firelight fade gently in your mind. Let the wind in the close grow far and soft. Let the dark be kind and soft and close. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.